And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. It's fantastic to be here with everyone. What a huge crowd it is tonight already. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia is still rocking the Cruel Summer look, which...
This is going to be the summer of the overalls. I love it.
It's great. We've been surrounded by the mask people. Walking around, and if they feel like in 80 degrees, they want to wear a mask. Yep. I guess
I got yelled at this week by a 90-year-old woman. Put on a mask.
Yeah, I mean, people look at me like I'm a rebel for wearing no mask. I'm just like, hey, I'm breathing normal air. Isn't that nice? But in Massachusetts, of course, it's the slowest of all the rollouts and opening up. But what's interesting in all this is that actually it was a terrible, terrible, terrible week for the New World Order, for these forces that are trying to force vaccinations and force surveillance, and for Big Brother and all that. Really bad week for them. So I'm going to get into that as well. But just to say right up front, between all the churches being ordered to open, which is dramatic, and that happened today at 3:00 with President Trump coming out and saying, nope, doesn't matter what the governors say, you're on. That's important because the governors have been abusing their power. And, so this is really a wake-up call that they can't do that, which is quite important because especially in states like Michigan, Massachusetts, New York, and California, we've seen this. Whereas in other states where they are opening up, like Georgia and Florida, they're having really, a much better time. Their economies are opening. The people are fine. The contagion is down. Here's the thing. Viruses don't survive in the summer anyway. So this is bizarre that they're trying to pull this whole thing. Even Fauci came out. Here was the first linchpin of the week, actually. Fauci comes out and he says, actually, lockdowns are pretty bad for everybody. After months and months of telling us.
That's a huge pivot.
It is. And he knows he has to get on board because all the stats, even though they've fixed them,
people are calling for his being arrested. So,
he doesn't want to go down with Gates when it all happens. But I do think this is relevant, and all of this ties directly into tonight's discussion, strangely enough. The other, I think, big moments that we saw during the week were a really large exodus of YouTube characters, like people like Joe Rogan getting off of YouTube and into Spotify because of the censorship. That's a big move. We've seen it with a few other people too. And what it means is that this clampdown, the real clampdown that they're doing and the censorship is working against them. And that's good because what they thought is they had a kind of social dictatorship through Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and all the rest of it. And really what it comes down to is people do not like to be censored. They want their ideas to be available. They want a marketplace of ideas. And I think the social media companies have really shown themselves to be kind of, Chinese-style dictatorship. And this is why China is definitely not ready to lead the world. This is the question. Can America lead the world? Can the West lead the world? This becomes over and over again the question. We have the opportunity, but we are a free society. Freedom leads. And when you have people locked down and you have the whole thing about forced vaccinations coming around, that's not free. And so either you say you're free and you aren't free, or you say you're not free. And if you say you're not free, we're going to have a big problem with it because the United States has a constitution. So we find ourselves in the middle of this whole battle. But I have to say, after giving it a real good once-over this week, all of the real wins were on the side of the good team. And let me tell you this in terms of politics. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Green Partyan, a Greenie, or whatever it happens to be, the UFO party, you want to back, in this country and in other countries, the people who want to open society up. It's very simple. The people who don't are not on the side of humanity. Very simple equation this time. I love it when things are laid out in black and white. The people who are pushing for excessive surveillance, lockdowns, tracer armies, all that stuff, that's all the deep, deep state establishment. We don't want to support them at all. Those politicians, they've been betrayed because those people in the background have said, we're going to grease things for you, and you're really going to bring this home for us. No, 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 no. People are resisting it, and those politicians will catch on. But for now, the ones who are opening things up, those are the ones we're behind. I don't care if they're Republican, Democrat, or Dixiecrat. Those are the ones that we're going to back. So leftist, rightist, doesn't matter. If you're for opening the states up, if you're for opening the country up, the different countries, open up Europe, the whole shebang, that's where we're at. And we certainly can manage a medical crisis. We've done it many times before, and those numbers have completely collapsed because they were exaggerated in the first place. And I think the real scandal here is looking into the Wuhan death lab, where they're developing these biological agents, quite possibly with the help of some of our professors, including Charles Lieber. And when you think about Lieber and his nanotech and all of these kind of, people on the payroll for China, that's the real scandal. That's what we need committees about, not another phony impeachment scandal. Or, where did the masks go for PPE? That's complete whitewash. I can't tell you. Another big bonker this week was Joe Biden. And Biden was that was kind of such an incredible gaffe today. He said
it's a deplorable gaffe.
It is.
That's what they're saying.
It is. It's a game changer, and he's alienating his own demographic. And he went on and he said, if you're not for me and you're for Trump, you ain't black. This is unbelievable language, and that would get any presidential candidate disqualified in any party. So the fact that they would hold on to him is, I don't see it. This is the weird thing, and I've made the prediction here before that Biden will not be the ultimate nominee in the grand scheme of things, although I think they were thinking about attaching a powerful VP to him and just getting him in his strange cerebral state over home plate and then having the VP take over. I think they've considered that, but I don't think they're going to make it. There's only so many videos.
It's certainly a race.
It's a race against time. So tonight we have a very big breakthrough show here with X-89. The whole series is interconnected. So every episode is a kind of breakthrough of information dealing with X-steganography, which is what we do on this program. And X-steganography, going through the system, being used as a catalyst, as a kind of footprint for secrecy through these different programs. And it's about moving projects through government programs and doing it in a stealth fashion. Every once in a while, like in tonight's episode, for example, we have something which is known on the record, which is explosive. And, I call them the TKO, and you always want to start off with the TKO. What I'm going to do tonight is we're going to delve into a group I've talked about before, which is called X-Protect. And X-Protect is a group that operates like an intelligence agency, but it's completely untraceable. I mean, the CIA in many aspects is untraceable, but X-Protect is a shadow wing deep in that intelligence community, and they deal specifically with the UFO file and X technology. They are known to discredit witnesses, to interfere with their thinking patterns. They're known to manifest as the men in black, using literally kind of astral techniques. And they are part of a program which is quite extraordinary, and we've tried to lay out here. But really, since the 1940s and 50s, this group has been active in pushing the narrative around, and sometimes with lethal force. And we're going to get into some of those examples tonight. One of the things that I've been able to do, because whenever we do shows on MK Ultra assassins that have shown up out of the blue and have this real deep intelligence background, but are assumed to be, lone cases. And this goes all the way from, the Batman shooter all the way back to Lee Oswald. And when we look at them and how they're put out there, it's always that agency behind them and the trail that they've left that allows the media to just say this person was a fanatic and therefore drop the story, don't look any further. And what happens over and over again is there are researchers who go deep into this and find us the real story, identifying X-Protect, which is a group that acts on that secrecy, as I said, in a lethal fashion. It needs to be identified because we've had a lot of people over the years write about things like Men in Black. And we've had a lot of people over the years say, well, this energy researcher got bumped off by the government, or this UFO researcher got too close to the truth. You know, this guy went to prison. These people associated, you know, for example, with 9/11 and exposing that, you know, a number of strange things happened to them, suicides and all the rest of it. And now we see this pattern operating in different sectors. So now we've seen COVID-19 doctors, for example, 2 of the major doctors involved in this now have turned up dead and very young. You know, one of the guys was 38. So we've seen the holistic deaths before, and the work of Erin Elizabeth covered a lot of that. But it's an extensive, deep story. It requires deep resources to get at it. You know, at a certain point, you had holistic doctors turning to each other and saying, "Are we next?" Before that, we had the bankers who were jumping out of the window. And when I talked to Catherine Austin Fitz about this, who knows a little something about finance, she said what was happening was they were deleting databases. And this is very important for us to understand is, for them and for these groups like X-Protect, I consider that there are groups for each sector. So if you're dealing with banking, there's one type of assassination unit for that. If you're dealing, for example, with UFO secrets, it's this group, X-Protect. When you're dealing with the medical community, you remember for a while there were all these doctors talking about GC-MAF and cures for cancer and things. They all got derailed. And they turned up dead under the most unusual circumstances, which, you know, even when we cover them on this program, I don't think it's really hard, even on our side, to spend the amount of time that's worthy on that, because it literally, you know, we could do 10, 20, 30 shows on it. It's so rich in detail, so tragic, and it's such an organized program. The reason we're looking at X-Protect and the UFO File during this kind of crisis is, oddly enough, during the COVID crisis, they've been rolling out a lot of UFO disinformation, and the usual suspects are there, the TTSA and CIA pulling the strings, along with the media setting up a very unusual system. For example, the Pentagon re-releasing videos that were already released through the New York Times in 2017, and which, if you actually trace it back, most of them come from 2007 YouTube channel. This is not major news, and those are terrible photographs, but wherever you see now that video, whenever someone's talking about UFOs, even if it's CNN or one of these really kind of not very reputable news sources, they are showing that and reinforcing that this gun footage image, that's what a UFO is. So the UFOs and all the research that all these people have done, Stanton Friedman, everything else for the last 70 years, doesn't mean anything. Just keep looking at this bad, you know, gun footage, gun camera footage, and think of Luis Elizondo being a disgruntled guy getting the truth out. Luis Elizondo was discredited by many sources, and especially the Black Vault, although I know he gave an interview to the Black Vault recently, probably trying to rehab his reputation. But the facts remain that all of the stuff that he came out with initially was all disinformation. And the To the Stars Academy identifies themselves as an entertainment conglomerate, and that's really what they are.
I think consortium.
Consortium,
is the word they use.
Yes.
What a word.
Now, it's kind of interesting, too, because that's one of those places where I agree with them. And for anyone who doesn't know, To the Stars Academy is a group that claims that with all these government insiders, who are all CIA predominantly, I mean, actually, it's over 100 years of CIA experience on their executive board, that they are going to, you know, open things up, and that they will bring the UFO file out, and that they will articulate the threat and get the military to deal with it and all this stuff. And everything is about a UFO threat. There's nothing about exploring other worlds, other consciousness, whatever. That's a threat. And then they also have paranormal research, as a matter of fact. So it's almost like they're moving in. This is the CIA moving into these areas that are right now independent and shaping opinion, shaping the narrative. So one of the things that got outside of their narrative is the X-Technography show that we're doing here, that we've been doing. And X-Protect is crucial because when we bring in those histories, I'm tapping into the research of people who don't lend themselves to UFO research. So when I look into people like Peter Dale Scott, the professor at UC Berkeley, he talks about the deep state. He's not interested in UFOs, but I can use that information that he's brought forward on the political side to determine what's happening on the secret technology side. When we look at people who've gone into this, like Jim Marrs, John Mack, just a phenomenal track record of individuals who've gone deep with research. We're talking about decades of research. We have the ability to bring forward the information on the UFO file. You don't need the Pentagon or TTSA or, surrounded by CIA agents or phony, the Bobo that they roll out with Tom DeLonge. And, it's very important for us to understand that the research exists and that all we need to do is find a way to tap into that vein and figure out where this intersects. Since there isn't any real media support for a genuine investigation, they just want to roll around in the TTSA, CIA business, and eventually use it as a UFO threat the way they're using COVID now. Actually, it's kind of interesting that TTSA, because most of the people on their board have some kind of doctoral, they've dabbled in medicine pretty substantially. I pointed out that Luis Elizondo owns patents of diseases. So it's unusual backgrounds a lot of these guys have. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 89, and we're going to be diving deep into X-Protect. And we're going to have some serious breakthroughs for you tonight because I'm going to identify things that are not on the record, and they're going to be shocking because I was shocked. And they are historical figures, and they're directly tied in to the research that we've been doing around the UFO file, and they're going to make very strange bedfellows. But before we get into that, how are you doing out there?
I'm doing great. Questions are coming in fast and furious, and I'm the only one in the ideas room. So
I saw Carly there earlier, but we always love it when she's out there, and you're just going to have to grin and bear it like the old days. All right, I want to start off with the Mississippi flag, which gets us into some very kind of direct Confederate-looking X-steganography. But it's important, this design is going to be important as we go forward because Mississippi and Mercury, Nevada will take a starring role tonight along with, Uncle John G. Trump, Nikola Tesla, Scientist Vannevar Bush, and James Forrestal. I want to mention that in the case of James Forrestal, that this is actually the anniversary now. And let me do the math real quick. This is the 71st anniversary of when James Forrestal, the first Defense Secretary of the United States, who was deep in the UFO file, was thrown out of a window at Bethesda Hospital, supposedly committed suicide because he was so depressed at what an incredible success he was. In fact, he was eliminated by this group, the very group we're talking about tonight, X-Protect. So it's kind of fitting that we hit the anniversary.
it's amazing.
It's not. It wasn't even planned that way, but here we are. All right. I'm going to take you back to an assassination and an assassin. And I promise that it's going to start off as one thing and turn into a mind blower. Okay, let's see if we all remember who this is. That is James Earl Ray. He is the assassin, in quotes, of Martin Luther King Jr., who was a fantastic civil rights leader who was very allied with the Kennedys in bringing about all the incredible changes in freedom in the 1960s. Now, the way that he was assassinated was on his hotel balcony, and across from the Lorraine Motel where he was staying, there was a rooming house. And supposedly, this person, who went by many names, James Earl Ray, he supposedly was the one who had done this, although the evidence was pretty thin against him and looked incredibly tailor-made, and no one actually saw him there, and there were no fingerprints that tied him to it, and it was one of those. Even more so, I think, than Oswald, it had this feeling of being a complete, well-rounded setup. Now, there's many details about the assassination that don't add up, including the fact that later, when they retried the case and the judge got a look at it, and this also went through the House Assassinations Committee, they found that the bullets that were in Dr. Martin Luther King didn't come from the rifle that they attributed to Ray, which would have released him under any other circumstances. And of course, they demanded retrials and all the rest of it never happened. But somewhere along the line, James Earl Ray had called himself Eric Starvo Galt. It's an interesting name for a lot of reasons. And he'd done a number of interesting things which don't really fit in with the narrative about him. We've talked before about the world traveling abilities of these supposed loser assassins who are working these minimum wage jobs and have no future and are disgruntled at the world and want to take a shot at somebody famous to make them famous.
Right, little men that want to be big.
That sums it up, actually. This is the program that they really laid on us as Americans in these different assassinations. But when we look at the movements of James Earl Ray before he assassinated King, it's pretty extensive. He's in Montreal, which is kind of a strange place to go for a crook from the South. And he certainly had been held in prison for low-level jobs that he'd done. And he had been in prison for robbing a grocery store, and they gave him 20 years. And somewhere along the line, during that sentence, he had only been in there a short period of time, but he escaped on a bread truck. And the people around it had always said it seemed like it was fixed, that he would get out. Of course, a year and a half later, there he is accused of assassinating Martin Luther King. Now, it's very important that there are stories that came out through the work of a lawyer named William Pepper, who represented James Earl Ray. He went and he found out that the warden in that case had been bribed by the local mafia. And he got $25,000 to just let Ray escape. They didn't know why. Now, when Ray escaped, he found himself needing a different identity, and he got a couple, and nobody knows who he got it from, except he said, well, I met this individual named Raoul. And Raoul moved me up to Canada, moved me over here. He had me running guns. He had me doing all these different things, including going to Los Angeles to be a movie director. While he was in Los Angeles, interestingly enough, he got a nose job, which is also kind of unusual considering he didn't, there was really...
Yeah, his nose was fine.
Nothing wrong with his looks.
Yeah.
So we're already looking at unusual things happening, but this is the pace and the track that he took just before that assassination. He was up here in Montreal, came down to Detroit. There we have him coming down to Birmingham, Alabama. Then he goes down and around to Mexico and over there to Los Angeles and then back to Atlanta. And it's from Atlanta that eventually he will go and assassinate Martin Luther King in Memphis. Yes.
Okay. Everyone is asking about McGill and MK Ultra.
Oh, they're fascinating. Yeah. Well, there's no doubt about it that the Canadian connection, which I've brought forward through people like Bloomfield, and how the Bloomfield papers are, a major piece, because Louis Bloomfield was not only friends with President Bush, one, but he was also the person who ran Permindex, which was basically Assassination Inc. out of Italy. And actually, Italy booted them for those activities. But all of his papers there, running Heineken and running these political operations, were there to be grabbed, and even were supposed to be released in 2003. That all ties in to the McGill aspect. So there's a huge connection with Canada here. Let's see if we can make some tracks in the geography. One of the places along the way that is identified with James Earl Ray is going to really get us into X-Protect tonight, because you might be saying, you know, the assassination of King is very interesting, but what does it have to do with X-Protect? I'm going to show you. And let's remember that is Martin Luther King before he was shot there. And, you know, he was shot. It's interesting. What we've discovered is that there was a military intelligence unit there, and supposedly they were keeping an eye out to make sure there were no riots or whatever. But they were actually used in the assassination and as part of this. And the scapegoat, the person that they needed to make the whole thing work, was Ray. When Ray goes to Los Angeles, as I said, he took up being a director, ill refute, and he spends a lot of time with this man, Xavier von Koss. Xavier von Koss, now this really doesn't make sense. Ray comes to him and wants to become a master hypnotist. He wants to learn how to do self-hypnosis and do all these things. And Xavier recounts his unusual obsession with power and being able to control people with his mind and all these things, as if he had been around programs like that, and here he was wanting to learn the tools for himself. Now, in my opinion, we're going to find deep evidence of him being a mind control assassin or patsy assassin. And I do want to stress that, yes, Ray was a low-level criminal, and he held up things like grocery stores and stuff, growing up in the South under impoverished conditions. But he was not any kind of a mastermind. And, you know, when they finally find him in England, after having committed a bank robbery there, he's headed to Rhodesia in Africa. And these are CIA strongholds. And they grab him because of his passport. And it is this Eric Galt passport. There's a lot of things about Eric Galt, which we're going to get into as well. And the Starvo middle name there, which is quite unusual. Eric Starvo Galt is the name that he used. Now, one of the things I want to point out is John Galt is the hero figure who has this motor that's supposed to transform the world in Ayn Rand's books. Now, what's interesting, it's Atlas Shrugged, the book. It's also interesting that James Bond uses this name, but it's slightly different. Instead of it's Starvo, it's Stravo.
Wait, no, it's Stavros.
Stavros, yes,
Blofeld,
exactly.
right?
And yeah, and that's interesting because James Bond shows up a few times here, but Ian Fleming gave this character the same birthday, which as himself, which I think is really interesting for a lot of reasons. But he also kept it as the middle name of the character, which, let's face it, is certainly questionable. So we find now that this person's been put together by two different fictional characters' names, and then we have Eric opening the whole thing up. Now, this pattern of three named assassins goes on through history. Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, John Hinckley Jr., Mark David Chapman. You know, it is something that's a signature and a pattern. John Wilkes Booth. The reason that they use it is because, you know, I mean, it's beyond normal recognition, but one of the key reasons they may use it is that the name pattern has to conform to what they're doing, believe it or not, with numerology. Now, when we get further into James Earl Ray, we find out that among all of his very unusual activities, shooting up to Canada, shooting over to Los Angeles, going to Mexico, He also shows up and works for a great deal of time in Mississippi. And he works for a shipping company, which, it has to be looked at on a few different levels, the extent to which this company is involved in the assassinations and how they are a direct link with X-Protect. And that's what we're going to get into tonight as well. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that Ray is someone who himself said after he pleaded guilty that his lawyers made him plead guilty to avoid the death penalty and that he didn't want to, and because he wasn't guilty. So he maintained his own innocence. So let's get a little bit of the history here from someone who was looking at it, who was a retired FBI agent named William Turner. And he found a very important lead in all of this. He actually went physically to Ray's residence, a low-rent hotel with a telephone booth in the lobby. The investigator photographed inside the telephone booth. The photograph showed a brief note, apparently in Ray's handwriting. They matched it up, which listed only a name and a telephone number. The name turned out to be a direct line to a manager at Litton Industries in Beverly Hills, a CIA front, Litton Industries, Beverly Hills. But they got all around. They even had a branch over here in Lexington. Then Turner, the FBI agent, former FBI agent, noted that Litton Industries operated a shipyard in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And when James Earl Ray had spent time in Birmingham, he had given the name and address of that shipyard, stating he was a former employee. So we have James Earl Ray, the accused assassin who became the guilty assassin of the Martin Luther King assassination, working in Pascagoula, Mississippi, for a shipping company. Now, what's going to really put a lot of these things together for us is that Litton Industries controls a shipping company called, what is the name of this company? Ingersoll. Now, what's interesting is, Ingalls Shipbuilding. Now, what's interesting about this is there's a major UFO case that happens out of Pascagoula, Mississippi. And what takes place at the assassination of King is this crazy pattern erupts where he takes off and he goes to England. And there are all these things. And they think they're looking for two different people, one named Eric Galt and one James Earl Ray. But if we dial it back a little bit, if we just look back there a year, we'll find him in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Now, Raoul, who is his handler, who moves him around doing gun running jobs and God knows what, remember his story is that Raoul told him to buy a rifle and get a room in that rooming house across from Martin Luther King's motel. And that he says, get the gun and leave it there. I'm going to show it to a dealer. You take off, go watch a movie and come back. And so his story is that he goes and he's getting his car fixed and he hears Martin Luther King was assassinated. And then he starts to figure it all out that he's been set up. That's his official story. It's actually going to make more sense as we get into this. Now, what actually happens though is further back when he's working in Pascagoula, Mississippi, he's working for the same shipping company that the two men who were abducted by aliens in 1973 are working at also.
Yes, you heard that right.
So Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, who saw the oval-shaped object that they said was 80 feet wide, and became one of the most famous cases down there because not only did they pass lie detector tests, but later witnesses would emerge and say, we saw the craft there, and at the time we were too afraid to say anything. I actually have those statements here in this article, the story is very true. That's what bothered me for 45 years. UFO witnesses speak. They're talking about the Pascagoula incident. And what's interesting is we're going to find out a few unusual things about Pascagoula, including the Calvin Parker, Charles Hickson story. Now, for me, I've always felt that the story was one of the best because of the witnesses, including the sheriffs and all the authorities around it, took it very seriously right off the bat. And J. Allen Hynek, who was the premier UFO researcher in the 70s, said he'd never seen a better case of abduction. He felt there was evidence there that these men had actually gone through this experience. Now, just a little snapshot of that UFO abduction, which is they worked there for Ingalls Shipbuilding. And it was a division that I tracked down the information exactly on which one it was and how it was connected, so there would be no confusion. And they literally were finished with work and had gone off to fish, and this craft came in, and according to Parker, it came in and he saw a huge blue light and then a spotlight that blinded them. And then they saw these very strange creatures coming toward them who looked like robots and took them on board the ship. And then they, tolerated an exam on that ship, and then they were let off, and people actually saw them there, the aliens letting them off in the water. And we're going to get into her testimony a little bit.
So there's witness corroboration.
Yes, and also I want to mention that Litton Industries was a defense contractor who worked very closely with the Central Intelligence Agency. And one of the main things that's in the NASA museum is this is the spacesuit that they designed. They were deep in the space program. And this is the thing I think we need to understand about Litton and Pascagoula. Yes.
Ray Daw says there's a branch called Litton Biometrics, which is housed at Fort Detrick.
Oh, yes. And we're going to see that Litton has become a piece of a larger military contractor, too. I want to show Litton's presence in Pascagoula, and I want to tie them all together. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. You can see we have some very big connections being made tonight, and it's great to have everyone here for this show because X-Protect is something that is really explosive in the sense that the closer we get to it, the closer we get to blowing the lid off these historical incidents. And it's absolutely crucial information. Now, one of the things I want to point out about Pascagoula to give us an idea of what's going on there in Pascagoula, Mississippi, right on the coast, is it has quite an unusual history for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons is that William Faulkner spent all this time there, and he developed many books while he was there. There's a picture of him actually in Pascagoula where he would meet his wife, and but where he spent most of his time was in a place called Horn Island. That is the novelist William Faulkner. Horn Island is right off of Pascagoula. It's actually only 10 miles away. But what it served as was a chemical warfare service quarantine station. Now, they tested U.S. biological weapons there during World War II. It was located on Mississippi's Horn Island. It opened in actually 1943. Then when the war ended, they used it for more exotic experiments. Now, there are all kinds of rumors about what they did there, including aerosols and things for mind control. And that the very heart of that level of experimentation took place in this deserted facility. What they have to say on the record is that the Army acquired it for use as a biological weapons testing site, and that's only 10 miles south of Pascagoula, real close, and that the island was managed and built by the Chemical Warfare Service, Special Projects Division. Now, it is interesting that, as somebody just mentioned about Fort Detrick, that the facilities employed between its Horn Island facility and the facilities at Camp Dietrich, which is what they called it then, about 1,500 people. So this is kind of the early development of these labs that were testing biological agents. Not so different from the Wuhan lab, interestingly enough. But this is something for us to keep in mind. And the Horn Island aspect, I think, is interesting and deserves a deeper look. But I think that the real kind of amazing explosion in all this is that we're looking at a connection directly to Litton Industries, which was a CIA-run defense contractor, and Ingalls Shipbuilding, which employed Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson, and then also employed James Earl Ray. And remembering that Raoul is suspected of having been an intelligence agent moving around Ray as an asset, and finally moving him into position as the ultimate patsy. But before he did, Ray left enough of a trail that it could be traced back, because he was in Beverly Hills at the time, and when they went back and they looked through his papers, they found this number. And then they found out, oh, he had actually claimed to have worked there. The question has to be asked, why Pascagoula? The proximity of Horn Island gets us in the vicinity, but now we're looking at assassination and the UFO file. And here is where we bring X-Protect together, because we're going to find out these are two branches operating in order to keep that UFO secret, and that they are also deeply, deeply involved in these kind of MK Ultra assassinations that we've seen. Now, a couple of quick things there about the facility itself. And there's a lot of secrecy around it, so even what's on the record is very questionable. But because of its proximity to human populations, only two lethal agents, both toxins, were ever tested to the island, botulinum and ricin, which is actually something that Saddam Hussein used on his population, which is a toxin I believe comes from the castor bean. The U.S. Navy used the site during the war to study mosquitoes and flies that were native to the Pacific Islands. In addition, an anthrax simulant was used in aerosol dispersion tests at the station. Now, it's also interesting to note that Faulkner wrote something very famous there called Mosquito. And here he was going to Horn Island, and, before, presumably, it became this army station, and he's writing all this stuff, and then they're doing tests on mosquitoes. It's a very unusual background. But the connections in Pascagoula get even stranger. And let's go into this a little bit. Now, what's interesting is when we look at the shipbuilding company itself, we've got it, just to give you some idea on the actual history that we're looking at there. Here's a little background on the company. One shipyard in Jackson County competed on a national level, even in the Depression years, the F.B. Walker and Sons boatyards. Now, F.B. Walker is the company that employed both Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. But what's interesting is it had been taken over at that point by Ingalls Shipbuilding. And Ingalls Shipbuilding was owned by Litton Industries. And Litton Industries was this company that was known to be working with the CIA and all these different things. Now, one of the most famous projects that they were working with them on is actually the Corona spy satellite, but we'll get into that as we go. Okay, so Ingalls Iron Works of Birmingham, Alabama, purchased the company, which had a 160-acre tract on the bank of the East Pascagoula River with a deep water channel. During World War II, many people from the surrounding counties traveled to Pascagoula to work at Ingalls. Women from the region entered the workforce and learned to weld and construct ships. From the beginning and after several name changes and technological advancement, Ingalls continues to provide the United States military with submarines and ships of all sizes and uses. It's internationally recognized for its craftsmanship and expertise in shipbuilding. Even today, they employ 11,000 workers. Now, the key there is that Ingalls took over F.B. Walker and Sons. So just to put it on the record without any dissent or anyone having the ability to say, well, the name was F.B. Walker, not Ingalls. Ingalls owned F.B. Walker. They had purchased them long before our friends got there. And so all three of our friends, Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson and James Earl Ray, are all working there at the same time.
That's amazing.
Incredible. And they will be abducted now in 1973. And James Earl Ray, of course, will get accused of, and he will be on this big worldwide chase on April 4th, 1968, of killing Martin Luther King. The impact of killing King is hard for us to wrap our heads around now because there is no leader really on the national stage who has anything of the kind of weight of King. And always killing a president, and things of this nature, when those types of assassination happens, it's always a big thing. But King was a preacher who was a spiritual leader. So like Gandhi before him, it was an earthquake when he died. I can't tell you how explosive this information is as we get deeper into it, but it blows wide open aspects of X-Protect and brings us right into the heart of the assassination wing of this, which has invaded our politics since the early 60s, and also the UFO file, which is the biggest national security secret of the United States and certainly other countries as well. It's not just us. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Here we are in X Series 89, and we're going to have a lot of breakthroughs. We're having some huge information downloads in this episode. And this happens sometimes, because as I said, the whole series interacts around these themes and opening up the research around the themes of X-steganography and advanced technology being hidden. And, we look into other aspects of that secrecy, like the mystery schools having set up this situation. But tonight we're dealing specifically with X-Protect, which is a 20th into 21st century apparatus, a clandestine arm of an intelligence wing mixed with an aerospace interest that creates a small intelligence group for managing the secrecy around the UFO file, and does it and works basically through many different government agencies, which is quite remarkable. Now, I want to remind everyone, especially with all the bizarre censorship, like I said, people were jumping off YouTube left and right because of the censorship. But what I want to make mention of here is you can go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but you're going to get the information that you need in terms of navigating things that are going on. You'll understand which shows that are coming up and the amazing guests we have coming up for you. Now, I have to tell you that we have a blockbuster show with a truly amazing guest who is going to really blow a lot out of the water. And this is happening very soon. So you're going to want to be on that newsletter list to make sure that you get the link to watch this, which I think will be a world-changing interview. So don't wait on that one. And remember that you heard it tonight first. So go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already. And that'll make sure that we have that pipeline directly with each other. So we don't have to worry, does Facebook censor it? Or we don't have to worry if Twitter blacked it out or shadow banned it. And we don't have to worry if YouTube takes us off the air. So these are the crucial things. I hate to even mention those things, and yet so many of our colleagues, we've seen them have problems with it over and over again. So inevitably, that's what we run up against. Yes.
So did Mae Brussel come up with the fact that Dornberger was on the board of Litton Industries?
She did.
Wow.
She did. And Mae Brussel's work is eventually going to pay off when we look at it through a UFO lens as well. And you're going to find also with Mae Brussel's work that her deep knowledge of the Kennedy assassination and of Watergate and of the Reagan administration and the CIA plays in. It actually gives a lot of things a foundation. And here's where I want to eliminate left and right titles, because Mae Brussel was about on the left-wing spectrum as you can get. She was there on the left coast, and certainly she was coming from a a leftist point of view in terms of, her political outlook. But she understood that the kind of forces that were working to eliminate the Constitution and install this other system, they didn't see political parties. They were just moving and working for these systems. Later, when you see people like Alex Jones, for example, is here on the right, he's saying, and he got a lot of that stuff about Bilderberg and all the rest of it from that foundation that was laid through people like Mae Brussell, John Judge. So there was a foundation there laid on a very left-wing track, which now those issues are looked at, everything's flipped over. I mean, boy, was 1984 right. Because when you think about it, this right-left thing, it doesn't mean anything. All you want is freedom. And if you have things that you line up with one party or another, then fine. But in terms of information and what we bring out, sometimes people will say, well, you said this, supported the left thing, or you supported the right thing. It's not true. The fact is, it doesn't matter. All that matters is the people who come forward. I honestly, if Bernie Sanders stood up and said, I want to reopen America now, I'd be for Bernie Sanders. I just want someone who will open up the country and make it free and respect the Constitution. If Trump says that, then that's who I'm going to get behind and say they're right. And if Ron Paul says open the country, as he does, I'm going to say let's get behind Ron Paul. That's the way that it should be. But I think it is interesting, and Mae Brussell is a real snapshot because her research wanted to get into what we now know as the deep state. And she really laid that foundation out there. And I'll tell you, even JFK researchers in those days, even as cutting edge as they were, they avoided her information because she was so cutting edge and was so, let's deal it, let's face the beast. Now, that was on little AM radio channels in California, and they had little zines that they would send out along with a tape cassette. This was the type of distribution that she had, and that people who were doing that kind of work in that period did. We have the ability, with the broadcasting ability of YouTube, online video, Facebook, Twitter, all of those, to reach a much more substantial audience. And it's crucial that we do, because every day, as we can see, these forces get closer and closer to having the ability to carte blanche run the lives of Americans and of citizens all around the world. Yes.
A cult fan says it's May's birthday 1 week from today, and we should do an X-Fan birthday observance celebration for her. It's also JFK's birthday, right? They share a birthday.
It is. And that's JFK 103. And we were thinking of something special about that. But yeah, Mae Brussell is outstanding. Her work was outstanding. Really, the foundation, think of Professor Peter Dale Scott. Again, that's somebody who's a UC Berkeley professor who gave us the foundation of the deep state, but you would snapshot him and make him more of a left kind of figure. So if you try to do this left-right thing, it doesn't work. The bottom line is you need freedom, and that comes through all different types of voices. You need the real information and that kind of transparency. Okay, so I think we made the point there. Now, we're dealing with X Series 89. This is the UFO File DISC now comes into this as well, Defense Industrial Security Command. And also, I'm going to make something here about the big Mercury, Nevada connection to all this. And we're going to get into more assassins and how this plays out. So
history is littered with assassins.
What we're going to have to do with this is break it into two parts ultimately, because it's quite an explosive amount of information for just a single episode. So you're going to see us roll this out over a couple of episodes. Okay. Not to mention that we're going to cover the Tesla, Trump, Bush Italian, not leaving those guys out. Okay. Meeting in a Winnipeg airport. Meeting in a Winnipeg airport. We're in Canada again. Who is this man? This is Richard Giesbrecht. He was a salesman who, during his various sales thing, would always stop in and go to the Winnipeg airport and dine there. So this one time he came in and something kind of unusual happened while he was there. This was the February after the Kennedy assassination. So we're looking at February 1964. Now, when we look at what happened in that incident, it's basically this. Here's the outline, and then I'll read some of the details. He comes in, he orders his normal dinner. There's somebody who is sitting across who's staring him down. That's one. Two, there are people behind him who are having a very open, rollicking conversation. And one of them has a wig on, and he has false eyebrows, and he has a kind of a freakish appearance. Now, you might remember, if you've been watching the X series long enough, that David Ferrie, who ran Lee Harvey Oswald since he was 15 in the Civil Air Patrol, was a character just like this. He had a condition which made him hairless, and so he would do things like wear wigs and all the rest of it. He was a CIA and Mafia pilot, and he worked for Guy Bannister, who originated the X-Files for the FBI. All of these characters come into play in this next section. For years, when it was said that Ferrie, by these researchers, was in the Civil Air Patrol with Oswald, mainstream media tried to kick it down and say, no, you don't have any proof, you don't have any proof. And then this picture came out, which clearly identified Oswald here, and then Ferrie over here. When they did a blow up on that, it was exact. And then they matched up his records in the Civil Air Patrol. There was just no doubting it. There's a lot of things on the record about Ferrie and Oswald being seen at the same time. There's a very deep, deep track record. But after the assassination, Richard Giesbrecht was in the Winnipeg airport, and he's having dinner there, and he hears these people behind him. And what they say, in essence, is, we don't know if Oswald, how much he told his wife, and that we need to have this meeting in Kansas City, and it's going to be under this textile group's name, but our group is going to meet there instead. Our group, in my opinion, being the X-Protect group. And he gives the exact address. And then the salesman starts to think, this is pretty wild. I'm going to start writing this down. And he makes a series of notes. And then he starts to hear, we have more money and more power than we've ever had. And what we're going to do is we're going to make it happen through Mercury, Nevada. Now, Ferrie, who had participated in the JFK assassination and had been the person who had guided Oswald into this position where he could be grabbed as a patsy, was prosecuted by Jim Garrison. And Jim Garrison basically saying, we're going to get him in trial. And so they have this conversation. They meet in a hotel room, and Ferrie breaks down and says all these things like, yes, of course, I knew Oswald. He was a wannabe. Jack Ruby was a pimp. And it was all CIA, and Clay Shaw is CIA. And eventually Jim Garrison would accuse this New Orleans businessman, Clay Shaw, of the JFK assassination. But Garrison had become convinced that the aerospace wing of the Defense Industrial Complex were the ones who had organized the JFK assassination. So then Ferrie turns up dead, as Oswald was dead and Ruby was dead. There was no way to prove this. And so he went on the record and he grabbed Clay Shaw. Now, one of the things that he did in between was he went after someone named Guy Bannister, who he knew. And it turned out that there were all these connecting pamphlets that showed that Oswald shared the same office with Guy Bannister. Now, Bannister has shown up many times in this program as somebody who originated the X-Files because he was the 1940s FBI chief in Chicago who had gone out to the Northwest to track UFOs, literally. So this guy originated the definition of X in those files to track UFOs because that was referring to X technology. Now, the X technology that the UFOs were using you can look at X technology in a variety of ways, but whatever it is, it resides in the UFO file. So the UFO file holds the X technology. A lot of people could look at this and say the X technology could be a Tesla technology. It could be a technology left over from the mystery schools, or it could be an extraterrestrial origin. Whatever it happens to be, that's where it resides. So when they have this protection unit, X Protect, over the UFO file, it's for a very definite purpose. This is what they're trying to protect. Now, so it's on the record that he ran Oswald. His secretary knew Oswald. She said he was in the office all the time. This was the summer of 1963, before Kennedy's assassination in November. Now, as soon as Kennedy is assassinated, then Bannister goes on, and then he dies of a strange heart attack shortly after that. And the Warren Commission never gets to interview him and all the rest, so they can never put on the record. But the person that worked with him in the FBI in the early 50s, late 40s, was someone named Robert Mayhew. They both worked in the Chicago office of the FBI. They worked together. Robert Mayhew was the person who handled the Howard Hughes estate, although he never met him, not even a single time. And then eventually, Hughes got suspicious that he was trying to basically run his whole empire and control him like a puppet. And what happens is that, to make a long story short, to get into our X Protect mold again, that there's a bookkeeper for Hughes who comes forward and writes a book called Age of Secrets. He's in Canada now. He's still alive. And I've spoken with his son. And John Meyer states on the record, and he reveals in his diary in the Age of Secrets book, which was banned in the United States, but which I do have a copy of, he states in the book that it was Robert Mayhew who organized the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and that, in fact, he had bragged about this. And that as soon as he got this information, Mayhew paid him a visit in New York and said, don't ever try to reveal anything about that. We've gone into the RFK assassination and how it was pulled off by Thane Eugene Caesar, who was a Lockheed employee. And on the record, it's Sirhan, and he freaks out and writes, RFK must die and all the rest of it. So in this series of assassinations, we have all these patsies set up, and we've seen this pattern in school shootings and in movie shootings all the way into the present day. But the reason I want to go back and really point out these assassins is because we're looking at an X Protect pattern with pretty much all of them. So in the case of Oswald, we have Oswald surrounded by all these NASA influences, including Dornberger, who someone brought up earlier. And Dornberger was a paperclip Nazi who came over here. He was von Braun's boss, actually. And Von Braun comes up tonight as well. But when we're looking at these figures, we have to understand a single thing, that there's a shadow structure operating inside the normal structure. So we have one normal kind of regular on the surface story in the case of all these major assassinations through this period. But they all have a strange tie over to the UFO file. Interestingly enough, including Ruby, by the way. But interestingly enough, James Earl Ray, until this was revealed tonight, nobody understood that they understood there might be CIA elements behind him, but he was not related to this X Protect aspect. Now we've directly shown that he is. One of the things I want to put on the record here, and there's deep information about this, but I just want to get this on the record. This is the House Assassination Committee from the Mary Farrell database. So Guy Bannister, who grew up in Vixen, Louisiana, he became an FBI agent in November 1934 in the Chicago FBI office from 37 to 54. Remember, Chicago was mobbed up completely. It was basically, when they came out of the 20s, the place was run like gang style by Al Capone and all the rest of it. So he's coming in the 30s. So it's still that influence. And it seems like you can't really get by without dealing with that organized crime faction. He technically retired in December of 54. He dies 6/6/64, right after, a few months after the Kennedy assassination. He and Robert Mayhew worked together in the FBI in Chicago during World War II. Now, this is interesting. During this time, Jack Ruby was arrested in connection with the murder of Leon Cook. This is December 1939. These were the agents who were dealing with that. So in 1939, 24 years before the JFK assassination, we have the person who originates the X-File UFO aspect for the FBI, Guy Bannister, with Robert Mayhew, who works with Howard Hughes and who Hughes' bookkeeper would say arranged the RFK assassination. Here they are working together in 39 with Jack Ruby, who was basically a gun-running nightclub organized crime figure. Here they are working with him all the way back then. Remember in the interview I did with Roger Stone, he said, Nixon, after the assassination, said, I knew this Jack Ruby character, we had used him as a witness as early as the late 40s in racketeering cases. So these figures move through history, and any presentation of them as just, ships that passed in the night and, had anger they couldn't control and in an outburst killed a major political figure. No, they're very organized. Look, we have all three of them, Mayhew, Bannister, and Ruby, in the same place in 1939. Bannister, who sets up the UFO file, but also controls Oswald just before the assassination. And Mayhew, who sets up the Rfk assassination and Hughes Aerospace. So you see, the foundation is there. It's replete as we go into it, as we look at Hughes. By the way, we're going to find that the Tex Thornton from Litton Industries, who, as we said, that whole Pascagoula tie-in, he is the former VP of Howard Hughes Aircraft. So finding that assassination wing inside of the aerospace wing is very compelling. That's why Garrison found it there. But it is always surfaces when we're dealing with this, because in aerospace is where you find the UFO secret technology. And here we are in the heart of the X technology. That's where you get X Protect. That's where you get people like Forrestal, who are looking at the 71st anniversary of him going out a window. Why? Because he's identified in MJ-12 documents as the person who objected to how they were doing this, that he wanted to tell the public about it, that he was disturbed by the way that they were handling the UFO aspect. And that's what happened with him. But what do we know about Forrestal? He's close friends with JFK. He takes JFK to post-war Berlin in 1946 and has him tour the ruins as a young congressman. So he's also a Catholic. And so we have to look deeper at these connections to understand the UFO part and to dismiss, the CIA trying to take over the UFO file in 2020, with little kind of clown routines like TTSA, and really get to the root of it, which is this is technology and information around technology that they've controlled for some 70 odd years. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 89. We're going deep now into X Protect. There's a lot to sift through here, but we're going to come back to Pascagoula, believe it or not, because it's a crucial piece. Now, everyone, on the second half of this program, which is coming up very soon, we're going to be taking your questions. So ask them all in caps, and Miss Olivia is going to be taking them for me. How you doing out there?
Good. The Jot wanted to know, does Daniel have a huge board with photos connecting all these people? It's a tangled web. Of course you don't. Somehow you can memorize all this and keep it straight.
No, I understand the temptation, absolutely. And there's something, I'll tell you, there is a web in which they operate, so that sometimes when things show up on one level, I know where things are going because I know what they're connected with sometimes. And then sometimes you just have to dive in and see, maybe this is right and maybe this is wrong. But the stuff that's going on record tonight is documented fact. There's literally, it's never been on the record before. James Earl Ray being connected with Pascagoula, being connected with Litton Industries, being connected with the UFO File and X-Protect, that's all new information.
This is totally fresh.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's also, it's compelling in this sense, which is this case, Pascagoula, oddly enough, almost as a trick of fate, has come back and resurfaced because Calvin Parker, who originally didn't want to talk about it and suffered a nervous breakdown, and it was Charles Hickson, who, remember, was 42 when it happened, and Calvin Parker was a much younger man, actually. He was 19 when it took place, which is incredibly young for this. Now, he didn't know how to deal with it because, first of all, alien abduction is very traumatic, regardless of which agency is making it take place, whether it's actual or not. Let's take a quick look at this case. But Calvin Parker, I wanted to say, decided, I'm going to come out and talk about it. It's later in life, and here I am now, let's see, 73. That would be about 47 years ago. Now, he decided, I'm going to come forward and talk about this finally because Charles Hickson is dead and no one else can really open this up. So let's take a look. This, on the bottom there is Calvin Parker, of course, and on the top, Charles Hickson. And this is the character, the creature that they say came out of that large ship, which was 80 feet wide and about 12 feet high, and abducted him. Now, what's interesting is I have just a little bit of audio of Calvin Parker talking, and let's see if we can get this going. While I am, Miss Olivia, you can
David Donaway has a great question here. A little off topic, but
yeah.
Does a religion have its own criminal syndicate, or does a criminal syndicate have its own religion?
Well, it is very interesting to think of it. It's kind of a religion acting as a criminal syndicate. But I do think that's a compelling way to look at it for sure. Yeah, what else you got?
No, I was just thinking about absolute power corrupting, and that, I hate to say it, but any man, women too, Gretchen Whitmer proves that, you get enough power and, you become a criminal. It just happens.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting about Gretchen too, which is she has become the real poster child for what not to be. And she was the big overreach governor in Michigan, and boy, is she hated by people in Michigan. So she did everything wrong. But she was probably promised in the back there, hey, if you really push this lockdown, we're going to make things good for you in the end. Well, it doesn't always work out that way. And so, that she put herself into this power trip position. It was quite fascinating to watch. But she's neck and neck with Gavin Newsom for the governor that really let down her state the most.
Well, the governor of Virginia is...
Governor of New Jersey,
impeached.
Governor of Pennsylvania. These are, Governor of New York. But, his crime record is arm and legs length long. Okay, let's keep going. This is Calvin Parker describing the incident in the ship. Let's just take a quick listen to this man who was abducted by a strange ship in 1973 in October.
Seen three bulky-looking creatures coming toward us, and they was probably 4.5, 5 foot tall. They built like football players, but I noticed they kind of moved mechanical-wise, and they was floating off the ground. By the time we stood up and turned around, they was there on us all at one time. So 2 of them got a hold of Charlie, 1 of them got a hold of myself, and instantly I felt like that I just got relaxed. Parker Clay.
Now, what's interesting when he says he just got relaxed, this will go on, of course, and is a real signature of UFO experiences where they are put into this very light state. Barney Hill said he was floating. And if you read a lot of the John Mack cases, they actually are, when they get abducted, they float through walls and things like that. So This gets into what we call Apotheum on this program. It's Apotheum. Apotheum is an effect that comes about as the normal laws of physics are disrupted. Now, there are things that create this effect of Apotheum. And certainly the UFO experience has all of the identifications of actual Apotheum. And we've seen things go on the record, ridiculous. People try to say, well, the person had a bad dream, or, they got into some situation where they fantasized the whole thing. There's too many cases on record for that. And we know that this has happened over and over again because, as we've shown, even in the case of Calvin Parker, other people saw the ship, So was that a sleep hallucination? Apparently not, because other people were having it too. So we have to really take a deep look at what happens to these people. Now, Apotheum is an effect that's something that they guard against and that they discovered when they were doing these projects and redeveloping the UFO, that they were getting these effects of transformational physics. Now, those physics melt down the rules of physical reality and the universal laws that govern them that we know. So, in a sense, protecting the secret of the UFO file becomes the ultimate national security secret because, as Joseph Farrell talked about torsion physics, that it makes the atomic bomb look like a firecracker. Let's think about that. So, when you're looking at Apotheum effects, you're looking at, in ancient history, things like the Book of the Dead, or when they talk about Atlantis, they talk about things disappearing in a night and a day. Or when they talk about this effect that took place, and they created a history of understanding that and going back and saying whatever it was that took place when the destruction happened in the advanced culture before Egypt, whatever it is that took place, whether you want to call it a comet or a sunburst or the results of misusing a 2-eye crystal in a kind of a nuclear reaction that took place, it still has echoes today. But all the same effects are there. It seems like all the physical effects, even the ability of the Earth to spin properly, changes. So in classic UFO cases, let's bring it into those. What do we always see? Cars stop. Power goes out. People have missing time. In many cases, in some of the earliest cases, the missing time can go on for months. In classic cases, it's a couple of hours that they're missing. They can't figure out what happened to them in between. So when we look at that missing time signature, physical laws dissolving signature, levitating through objects, going through walls, through doors, Calvin and Charles, in their abduction experience, they are floated, levitated into the crowd. They don't walk in. They're knocked out. They're still conscious, but they are put into this everything's fine, I'm floating state. If you ever go back and listen to the Barney Hill hypnosis tapes, he says, oh, isn't this great? I'm floating. So it's almost like a drug type of effect. And then when they get in there, they get reassured telepathically, we're just going to do some tests on you. Don't worry, it won't hurt. And then it does. So they don't always know what they're doing, or they're trying to give them a suggestion to relax. So when we think about UFOs, we should think about Apotheum with it, because it's not that these countries, America, Russia, and China, are all so nervous about us understanding that there's another civilization. That's a big enough secret, no question. But I think the lethal aspects of a group like X-Protect are put in play because there's something in that UFO file, it's this Apotheum effect, that they don't know how to control. And since it's out of their control, they're frightened by it. And since they're frightened by it, they don't want anyone else around it. And they've withheld that information from the public for decades. And they've withheld it largely because they want to use it for their own projects, and they want to have that advantage of using it, so that they're working now on different levels of medicine, different levels of science, and they're so far ahead of the normal society that it's become this kind of schizophrenic situation where it seems obvious to us that there's a UFO factor happening. So, how can you keep people in the dark about that? Well, you don't. The answer is what you do is you roll out another phony CIA exercise, the same exercise that says, oh, this assassin was a lone, nut who wanted power and killed this big important person, when in fact those people, those leaders, are removed as obstacles for groups like the deep state who need to harvest humanity and have that kind of centralization of power. You get people like the Kennedys who come in looking at freedom, talking about the freedom to lead an inspired life, opening up space. There's not going to be any war in space. We recently changed that. Space is a war-fighting domain. These are very major policy decisions that that impact all kinds of different industries: financial, medical, developmental, construction. There's this interesting story about the CIA agent who was talking about why we were so obsessed with Cuba. And he said that the plans that they looked at, the people had already picked out parts of Cuba and named the buildings and named the establishments they were going to build and all the rest of it. So for them, it was a huge economic move. The same thing with Vietnam, that there are all these other factors. And on the surface, we say, well, at the time, communism is coming in, just like we say, oh, the Iranians are going into Syria. We have to send bombs over there and protect Israel. No, it has nothing to do with that. And just like in Vietnam, operating there for 2 decades, largely as a drug trade, as a drug corridor for the Central Intelligence Agency. Afghanistan, it moved from Asia to Afghanistan, which became the hugest drug center. And how long have we been there? 20 years. So you see, it's essential in society for us to bring these things into a conversation that we can have about them so the public can decide what's happening instead of living in the dark. And then once in a while, things like 9/11 happen, or the deep state crashes in and they're like, hey, we're taking over because of the COVID virus, or what Professor Scott would refer to as deep events that change policy, from assassination to, Iran-Contra. If you really look deep into Iran-Contra, what are you face to face with? The Strategic Defense Space Initiative, really. I mean, this is when you need a lot of money, where do you go? So this is where a lot of these things come together in history. We can get a much better picture from figuring out what it is that's been taking place. Okay, now Mercury, Nevada.
All right.
This is next. How are you doing out there, Ms.
Doing great. I have a great question.
Sure.
Matt M says, did DJ ever have a mohawk? It's punk rock yet business. I see it. It's in his aura.
You're going to have to leave that one to your imagination. Okay. Deep imagination.
But I will say this. You looked very different. There was a time. Okay.
I will say that one of the interesting things in looking back at, I was playing a lot of stuff and I was thinking about all those bands that came out that had a political edge to them, like The Clash and people like that. And I'm wondering, as I'm looking around, the millennial aspect, and I never want to group any one set of people under a dumb name like that, but I'm really looking for some political stuff in the younger generation, which has a political edge that just isn't some, cooked up CNN, hey, think about this as politics. Where are the real deep, the 60s had Bob Dylan, right? He came back and he did a JFK assassination song a couple of months ago. And what happens? It goes to #1 in the middle of all this. It's very interesting. But if you go through there, you see the 70s had their political aspects. The 80s had all these anti-nuclear concerts and, like We Are the World and all that stuff. And there's all this concern and things coming through music. And then using music as a force of revolutionary change in the popular culture gets completely sucked in to, corporate versions of rap and, Beyonce halftime shows and things like that. It's nothing to do with what music is all about. So it is quite remarkable, the era that we're living in. So that's what that made me think of. Okay, so let's move. Well, you got any more?
That's good for now. Yeah, that's good. I will say this. Okay, Ed Kaufman said something interesting.
Yes.
Did you know that the hotel where John Trump raided Tesla's room after his death,
Yes.
that hotel was later purchased by the Sun Myung Moon cult and became the cult's international headquarters.
Yes.
And
also,
so is there kind of an Apotheum overhang from Tesla?
well, let's remember this, that Tesla in 1899 caused an earthquake in New York City. And they said that, they told him, oh, you couldn't do that. And he said, certainly you can make earthquakes in cities. Like, it's simple. And I can give you a demonstration with no loss of life or whatever. And they were like, oh, you're smoking Serbian weed. And he did it. He caused an actual earthquake. The authorities came to him and said, what are you doing? Shut it down, whatever it happens to be. The Tesla work is very advanced, and we're going to get into Tesla as part of it. This is going to be a two-parter. There's no doubt about it. But the Tesla aspect is crucial if you understand the John Trump aspect with it, because John Trump is the protege of Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush, who was the head of MIT and who was also in charge of the science division of the United States under FDR and Truman, and had that deep relationship with the scientific community. He was the top scientist in the country. And he is the person who was the mentor to John G. Trump, but he also is the person who recommended him to obtain Tesla's papers on behalf of the FBI, to go through them to make sure they didn't fall into enemy hands and to see what was in there, and to also take over what was in there. And of course, glibly, when it's all done, he says, oh, I went through it all. It was a bunch of unrealized thoughts and ideas, nothing to see here, move along. But if you look at John G. Trump's career, there's a lot of fascinating aspects. This is a person in the heart of the UFO File territory, because his mentor is Vannevar Bush, who, on record, is the person who ran the UFO File for many decades. And the person who identified that was the physicist Robert Sarbarker, who was written out of history. And I make the point often on this show, when you go to Wikipedia and you punch in Robert Sarbarker, it says this person does not exist. That's what we call being memory hole. And so the episode I would point everyone to on that is Tesla, Trump, and the time capsule. But we're going to get into those aspects because they encompass everything that we're talking about here tonight. Interesting one, though. Yes. Go ahead.
One more?
Sure.
Okay, bend over. DJ, who is at the top of the food chain who want Apotheum to be under wraps?
Well, it resides... The secrecy group, X-Protect, resides somewhere in a blending of the deep intelligence wing and the aerospace wing. That's what we know. It's related. When we see the X-37B going out on these secret missions that no one knows what it's for, but it's the most advanced space plane we have, supposedly, the X-steganography is in the heart of it. In SpaceX and in the satellite links, the X-steganography is in the heart of it. So they're still using it. And for those of you who don't know, the X-steganography is just a signal. It is a way of telling one group, we are using that. And so SpaceX, using the X technology, they're signaling it by the naming convention that they're using. This goes back to Walter Dornberger, and who was the paperclip scientist that we took over here. And he's the one who developed the series of X-planes. And the X-planes, the X-15 still holds the record for manned spaceflight for a space plane. And that was done in the early 60s. So what does that tell you? That's over 50 years ago. Isn't it strange that somehow they would still have the record? So that they didn't want to display, they don't want to display the X technology. They brought it up to a point and then they had it go black. Now, we are monitored. by Russian satellites, just like we monitor their satellites. So they have to have some kind of clandestine way to demonstrate this technology. And when you look at the SpaceX satellites and how they block out the stars, in essence, when that thing is a ring, just like the space fence around the Earth, it's going to be easy to get these things off the ground and demonstrate them without these other countries being able to see exactly what you're up to. There's no question in my mind that this is a big factor that's involved.
I've got a great question here. So
Yes.
Love Arm is asking, is
Mhm.
Apotheum related to synchronicity? You found out something interesting about synchronicity today.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, and it has to do with Ken Thomas. Actually, he wrote an excellent book. I have it around here somewhere. JFK and UFO. Doesn't get any more in your face than that as a title. And I've always liked Ken's work, and I've talked to him over the years. He is a big fan of Arthur Koestler's work, and there was a character in one of these Arthur Koestler books who, before Carl Jung used the term synchronicity, he was developing this system which he called seriality. And he was noticing these things would happen over and over again. He would say a word, or he would write something down, and then someone would come in and say it. Or he'd see someone who was wearing a certain type of clothing that was unusual, and then immediately he'd see them again. So what he started to do is he kept a log of these things. You know, this happens to us sometimes, the major synchronicities, and they really tell us that something major is going on, or people will start to see the same number combination. These are fascinating things, but seriality was his version of it, and he kept these logs of it. And then somehow, either riding off that work or in his own explorations, Jung came up with that very deep science of synchronicity, which goes far beyond coincidence. Very, very interesting stuff, though. Wow. And I think when you're in that realm of possibilities, you start to get into, you know, what the mystery schools call know thyself. That it comes into the Gurdjieff work too, and around Steiner's work. When you are getting in to the deeper aspects of that sort of psycho-spiritual connection with your own inner self, all of these things start to open up. It seems like just the kind of straight ahead base material level, physical level, politicians fighting things out, that kind of world melts away practically, and all these other possibilities start to kick in. So we have all kinds of capabilities that we over and over again in traditional society, which, remember, is generally designed to harvest the people operating inside of it by a very small group. So we see this over and over again, and yet we also want to move society forward. So we're working with this, you know, in a hopeful sense, while watching this massive harvesting operation going on. But I think the key to all that is that they don't want you to realize that you have all these tremendous abilities, you know. And I look at the work of like Gigi Young, and, you know, the kind of psychic possibilities that she gets into. And when we look at the work of remote viewers, which even the government employs, and by the way, the government has massive programs around the more mystical subjects, and they just don't want you to know about them. And when they get out, like remote viewing or whatever, you know, what can they do? It's already out there. But make no mistake, and one of the weirdest things we've brought forward on this program in relation to X-Protect, which is the group that protects the information and the X technology of the UFO file, sometimes, in the case of Morris Jessup, for example, with a lethal, you know, mostly it's to discredit people, but once in a while they will use these very severe methods. But that whole Men in Black wave comes out of this. And the very first UFO case, actually, that was on record, that was major, actually it was pre-Roswell, was the Maury Island case. And this is the case that, you know, we're going to find very unusual figures around, like Kenneth Arnold before his big sighting, and like Fred Chrisman, who is a character that's associated with people like Guy Bannister. and that whole X-wing of the FBI search for UFOs. It's quite interesting to look at the Men in Black factor, because you have to wonder, where does that even come from? And the idea of using an astral agency, because things that happen are so unusual. People say that time seems to slow down when they're there, that they had a kind of an Asian appearance, and that they seem to be dressed in ways that were out of step with the times, even though everything would be brand new. So when people were seeing them in these periods, they would have cars and things that were 20 years in the past. So, and then often they would do unusual things, like when they would visit somebody, that person would start to have bad luck or die or whatever it would happen to be. So there's a very strange aspect to X-Protect, which just goes far beyond just assassination teams. And that's why I refer to them as astral agencies. It's interesting that I mention this because in the Ken Thomas book, he was talking about this figure who observed these UFOs, that Harold Dahl is the character, and he's on a ship and he sees these donut-shaped large UFOs, and they're all hanging around this one that appears to be malfunctioning, and it sort of spits out this stuff that kills Dahl's dog and burns his 15-year-old son's arm and basically destroys half of his boat. And this is the whole Maury Island case. And then when he starts to get this information out, he gets a visit. Now, actually, I'm going to read just a little tiny bit of this before we go any further, because it's going to tie in with our Pascagoula aspect. So when this man in black shows up, quote, Dahl thought that the man might have been someone looking to buy salvage lumber, which was his business, since such buyers often approached him in the wee hours of the morning. This is in Washington State, by the way, the Maury Island case. The man wore a black suit, however, and drove a black sedan 1947 Buick. When he arrived the day after Dahl's encounter with the flying donuts, after he accepted the strange man's invitation to breakfast, Dahl took his own Chrysler to a small cafe in downtown Tacoma, followed by the black-suited man in the black Buick. The conversation was not about lumber, however. Rather, the man in black made it explicit that he knew a great deal about Dahl and presented some veiled threats about Dahl's continued happiness and future well-being of his family and success of his business. This is an arm of X-Protect showing up to get some business done. This is the very first case on record, even before Roswell, and already there's a man in black factor. So it's an instant aspect of UFO encounters. And so he's giving him these threats. As Dahl took umbrage at what he heard, the mysterious figure then described in detail the UFO events of the day before. He knew the shape of the craft, their maneuvers, the discharged debris, and the reaction of the crew members. The whole story in detail. I did think it was rather fantastic how this gentleman happened to know that I had what I had seen, Dahl later told Kenneth Arnold, who is the person who goes down to investigate it. Which is, Kenneth Arnold is where we get the term flying saucer, and he's the pilot who saw them in Mount Rainier in Washington. And I was quite sure he hadn't talked to any of my crew, and I know he hadn't talked to me before. In fact, I'd never seen him before. Having made his point, the dark man left the breakfast meeting, thus an early and consistent corollary experience to many UFO encounters entered into the lore, the Men in Black. The history of these strange operatives had been documented extensively in UFO literature and lampooned regularly in movies. Darkly dressed, tight-lipped operatives of some sort show up on the scene after various sightings in the month that followed its original report to Kenneth Arnold. So what's interesting is these guys hang around, and then he blows them off and he says, no, I'll talk about it if I want to. So his son disappears. And then his wife gets sick and his business gets closed. I mean, he really has a terrible hard time. And they come back to him and give him an offer and say, basically, things can go back to normal if you just renounce the whole thing. And he does. Now, interestingly enough, his son calls. And his son is in a town called Lust, Wyoming. And he's working there in this place, bussing tables. and he doesn't remember how he got there or what happened to him or anything.
Does he have total amnesia? Like he doesn't know who he is?
He remembers who he is. He doesn't remember what happened in the 3 months that he disappears. And I think what's fascinating about that story, if you dig into it, is the son is kind of the first missing time character in the UFO file lore, if you really think about it. And so the son eventually rejoins his father in Washington, and the father never speaks of the incident again. But what's interesting as a kind of addendum to that story is that the Air Force officers who come to pick up the slag that came off the UFO and investigate it, he packs it up for them and they take it, and then their plane explodes. So everything around Maury Island, that case, is very unusual. But what happens is there's a character in there who owns the company, and he's partners with Harold Dahl, and his name is Fred Crisman, and that's something that in the work of Ken Thomas, he goes into Crisman a lot. For our purposes, all we have to say is this, is that Jim Garrison in 1981, when he gave an interview, and he was the DA who had investigated the JFK assassination and decided it was the aerospace wing of the defense industrial complex that did it. And they said to him, is there anything that you would do right now? What would you do if you had the ability to prosecute the case? And he said, I would prosecute Fred Crisman. Now, Crisman is a very strange, unusual character. And not a lot is known about him, except Garrison was convinced that he was an assassin for Boeing, which is the military contractor that he thought was at the heart of the JFK assassination. For our purposes, what we can do is understand that X-Protect operates through military contractors in that aspect of the deep state. But it is a very obscure, small group that sets off tremendous things and works in absolute secret because they oversee the UFO file. I mean, they're overseeing this aspect. And so when we hear things like the CIA rushing out these stories about UFO threats, or if we hear that the CIA are nice guys now and that they want to share the UFO file with the public, and they even take on the pose from the point of view of the media, where they come out and say, like, the government has to stop hiding this. They're the CIA. They've been hiding it for 75 years. Remember, the CIA is not even a constitutional, they're extra constitutional. It is a completely artificial design in American government. It has nothing to do with anything. You can have a spy service operate out of your Pentagon, and the intelligence wing of the Pentagon was, this whole apparatus of the CIA was set up just to complement that, just like they had the OSS during the war. This thing that grew out of it, where an X-Protect growing up inside of that became a challenge, especially when the UFO aspect comes up. When we go through the presidents from Eisenhower through Kennedy, through Reagan, Carter, these presidents all tried to get that power and ability back. When we see Trump using the Space Force, that's to get at the UFO file. There's no doubt in my mind. So what we have to remember, the simple rule to adopt is you don't deal with the CIA in relation to the UFO file. It's always lies. And, I'll give you an example. In 2015, the CIA came out and said, remember all those sightings of UFOs in the 60s and 70s and all those? That was us. We were just testing experimental stuff. UFOs don't exist. Suddenly, the CIA wants to be your friend on UFOs, and they're using the media to use the same story about this footage, this grainy footage, and how there's a UFO threat. That's to be thrown out. That's junk. And it's very dangerous. And so in the UFO world, with those writers and those researchers, they have to understand that, you can't in 2 or 3 decades say the CIA has been blocking us, the government's been blocking us, and then suddenly say, hey, the CIA are our friends, and they want to give us the UFO file. Isn't this nice? And they want to get it from those other bad people in the government. I mean, the CIA is where so many of these things reside, which are outside of constitutional purview. And if anything, they're the group that needs to be reined back in. And their information needs to be subservient to a president who wants the information about the UFO file. Then it becomes between the apparatus of the government, the presidency, and the citizens, not this weird little interspersed agency that's put itself in the middle of everything. So it's kind of a crucial aspect for us to remember. Okay, here we go. X Series 89, we're deep into it now. This is a fantastic crowd tonight with great questions. We're going to be taking your questions in just about 10 minutes here. And Miss Olivia's ready at the trigger. I can feel it. How are you doing over there?
Yes. Have you brought up Mercury yet? Are we still leading up to that?
That's the section we're getting into.
Okay.
There's a lot to get to, obviously. And, you know, we are breaking this into 2 shows. So it's going to overlap directly into our next episode. So whatever we don't get to tonight, don't worry about it.
Okay.
One thing I want to point out is Mercury, Nevada. Remember that I mentioned that this character was in the Winnipeg airport. I never actually finished his story. So the salesman is in the Winnipeg airport, and he hears these very strange people, including David Ferry, going off about if they think they'll get away with it and what their next plans are. And they mention Oswald, and they mention a place in Kansas City that they're going to all meet under the name of a textile group. And what you're going to find is that some of the early factors around some of the setup of the assassinations, they would often use the Minutemen as a fall guy. So there's this patriotic group, the Minutemen, and it's sort of like, a constitutionalist type thing. And they're sort of like radical militants in the 60s, and they want things to go back to the way that they were before all this liberal society kicked in. So keep that in mind, because a lot of people have suggested that the group that they were setting up this meeting, that the cover group is the Minutemen, but inside of that Minutemen meeting are these X-Protect people. So there's very openly talking about it, and here's the salesman hearing all these details and thinking, I got to write this down. And he's writing it down, and he hears them start to talk about how everything has to pass through Mercury, Nevada, and how Mercury, Nevada is at the heart of whatever it is that they're doing. And these are part of the notes that he mentioned. Now, interestingly enough, by the way, this isn't a show where we give any fuel to theories about that we didn't go to the moon or anything like that. However, there are very strange things about the way it was portrayed and the way that it came off. If you're interested in like the work of Richard Hoagland, for example, there's a lot of strange things about it, although Hoagland very much believes that we went to the moon. There's always been that question of, did they film the moon landing and did something else happen, or did they never go to the moon? And the moon hoax aspect. The person who wrote very authoritatively and with great research on this was a guy named Bill Casing. And his book was literally called We Never Went to the Moon. And it does, I will say that one of the kind of fascinating things that happens in his work is he documents people who are bringing forward things to Congress saying that it didn't add up what we did versus the money spent and all these other factors, and that they thought something else had happened. And whenever they go to present something to Congress, something weird happens to them, like their car explodes or they get run over by a train or whatever it happens to be. And it sounded like a lot of X-Protect style activity. Now, it may not be for the reason, but it might be for the reason of the fact that they're protecting a secret that we didn't go to the moon. But it might be that they are protecting elements around how they operate inside that system and create false narratives and create versions of what they do. In any case, in the work of Bill Casing, he claims that the entire moon landing was set and staged and filmed in Mercury, Nevada. And this is one of the things about how Mercury gets on the kind of like on our radar a little bit. In the Torbit document, which identifies the Defense Industrial Security Command, and I brought it up in this program because it's kind of the WikiLeaks of its period, but there were things in it which are essential for us to understand this apparatus of aerospace. And that takes us all the way into this privatization area, like Bigelow Aerospace or SpaceX, any of the things that are happening, the Space Force announcement. We have to understand how the setup around the moon program and the space program started to understand what they're doing now, because they shut off for 50 years flights to the moon, which is absurd in any normal progression. Where'd you go for 50 years? Hey, where you been? So that's how a space program goes black, interestingly enough. That's where the secret space program aspect comes from. Okay, now that that's clear, what happened was when the salesman was in this Winnipeg restaurant, he overhears them discussing these things, and they mention Mercury, Nevada. Now, he decides at a certain point he's heard enough, and he gets up to leave, and he looks back at the two characters, and they look at him, and they figured it out pretty quickly. And the other person who was staring at him, by the way, the person who was sitting with Ferry, he identified as someone who was Latin. But it also sounded in that conversation like they mentioned Bloomfield, and they may have mentioned Bronfman, who was a big power player there in Montreal. Yes.
And
the earpiece.
He was wearing an earpiece.
Yes, he was wearing an earpiece. And oddly enough, when the salesman started to write notes, he noticed their conversation changed. And he looked over at, so what we have is a situation where he's sitting here, and then behind him are these two people having this wild conversation. And then across from them is a very strange husky guy who has tattoos on his hands, who's well dressed. It's kind of like a mafia figure, just glaring at him, as if he's not supposed to be there. And when he starts making notes, the person with the hearing aid changes his conversation. So probably that's not a hearing aid. It's probably one of those kind of the best that they could have of electronic technology of sending messages at the time. So it's kind of like a two-way radio there. And it might be set up so that if police or whatever come in, they know not to continue with their conversation. But they change the conversation to something completely banal out of the blue. This guy gets scared, the salesman. He gets up and he goes to leave, and he is feeling like there's somebody behind him. When he looks around, nobody's following him. He gets to the phone and he calls the RCMP in Canada, and he says, I'm trying to get through, and can you let me speak to an officer? And when he looks up, that weird character who was sitting there is right in his face. And he slams down the phone and he takes off. And he makes it by mingling in with a gigantic crowd, and he gets away. Now, he brings that story out, and it's also kind of interesting to note in this period where this is taking place, there's a UFO wave, which is also kind of odd. So years later, now, he gives all the information out because there was a report that he gave to the Royal Canadian Police. And it all comes out in 1968, the whole thing. And then Garrison tries to get him to trial to identify Ferry and all the rest of it. He does identify Ferry, but he never makes it to trial because Ferry never makes it to trial, and he's never called as a witness. And his story, he dies in 1990. He does survive, but he says that he was instantly threatened as soon as the story surfaced. Now, that is the essence of the story. A lot of people think he was sitting with Louis Bloomfield. And there are names that he mentioned which we're going to go deeper on. But for the time being, what I want to get across is that what he hears is Mercury, Nevada. David Ferry, who's just had a big hand in organizing the, Oswald and the assassination cover, who's a CIA mafia pilot who works with Guy Bannister and this whole crew. He has now just identified Mercury, Nevada as a crucial place, along with this meeting in Kansas City. Now, what's interesting about this, I feel, is that Mercury, Nevada has this other history where people ascribe things like the shooting of the moon landing there. But of course, it encompasses and is actually in part of Groom Lake, Area 51 on the other side. So the idea of UFO development, reverse development, all that thing that takes place, Mercury, Nevada, here they are again talking about these things. It's quite remarkable. Now let's take a deeper look still.
What else do we know about Mercury, Nevada?
Well, I'm going to give you just the basics, but one of the things I want to say is that President Kennedy showed up in Mercury, Nevada. And what he did, which is a very unusual move, no president had ever visited it. But he said, I'm visiting and let me know what the accommodations are. And they said, Mr. President, we don't have any kind of an airfield that can accommodate Air Force One. So, you know, maybe you better send a representative in a private plane or something like that. Kennedy says, no, build an airport for me to come in. This is a very unusual thing. Kennedy was incredibly frugal with the Air Force budget, and he was somebody who didn't like expenditure. And he didn't like making a big deal about what he was doing or even security. For him to insist that they build an airport that he can land in and visit them is quite crucial. And there he is coming in. Now, why is President Kennedy coming in? What does he want to see? And eventually these questions will come back around and they'll explain from the Kennedy administration, well, he wanted to see the development that we have of advanced rocketry. And they said, what do you mean advanced rocketry? And they said, well, we can't get into it too much, but it's nuclear-powered rockets. This was the cover story for whatever the advanced technology was there. Because, of course, we didn't wind up taking nuclear rockets into outer space. Too dangerous. Now, keep that in mind, and let's just go to some basic history around Mercury. Mercury is a closed village in Nye County, Nevada. It's 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas, and it's situated within the Nevada National Security Site and was constructed by the Atomic Energy Commission. In fact, they had set off many nuclear explosions there. To house and service the staff of the test site, the specific site was known as Jackass Flats, and nearby Nevada Test Site 400. Today, the site is governed by the United States Department of Energy. Now, I'm going to tell you something very strange about this. Kennedy set up, after this visit, to have the United States Department of Energy building built and called the John Forrestal building, which eventually they did make in 1969.
Wow.
And he laid out the plans himself personally, choosing the architect and all the rest of it. And that's a shot of it there.
Wow.
This is quite curious, again, with Forrestal. And then we have to ask ourselves, why is the United States Department of Energy, you know, the governing site for Mercury, which is ostensibly an advanced weaponry developmental base? Okay, let's keep going. As for the test site, the village is not accessible to the general public. It was named after the mercury mines which flourished in the general vicinity a century before the village itself was established. The village started in 1950 at the beginning of operations in the Nevada test site as Base Camp Mercury, a military-style encampment built to provide basic facilities for the personnel involved. So this is kind of the basic idea of it. Base Camp Mercury was formally renamed Mercury, Nevada in 1957. The Navy launched 9 atmospheric sounding rockets to measure nuclear radiation and other atmospheric data using Mercury as a stage area in this period. In the early 60s, the village population now actually grew over 10,000. There was a school established and all the rest of it. The village flourished until 1992 when all but subcritical nuclear testing ended in Nevada test site as a result of the United States Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That's an interesting thing, which we have not signed on to that treaty, even though we honor it. The population shrank rapidly thereafter. The last known census, 500 people. That's where, and at the very top there, right beyond it, is Area 51. Now, one quick thing I want to do is read from the testimony of this salesman about when they mentioned Mercury, because I think some of that is kind of crucial. All right, and so we get this from the person who is the client of the salesman. Is the representative of the salesman. And he says, on the afternoon of February 13th, my client, a salesman, had an appointment to meet a customer at the new international airport in Winnipeg. My client arrived early and sat in the cocktail lounge to have a drink. After finishing the drink, he walked around the new building, then returned to the same table. Immediately behind him were seated two men who were not there previously. They may have missed him, which is why they were so freewheeling with the conversation. He could overhear them talking about the Oswald case. One of the men was wondering how much Oswald really knew and how much does she know. This was undoubtedly a reference to Marina Oswald, who had testified before the Warren Commission on February 4th. Her photo was on the cover of the most recent issue of Time magazine. A name was mentioned sounding like Isaacs, who was apparently seen on film after the landing. The FBI later wrote Love Field next to this comment. So when Kennedy lands in Love Field, this figure is in the film. Further conversation could be heard in bits and pieces, such as, if Oswald is found guilty, the Bureau will stop investigation. Of course, Oswald was already dead, but they're talking about in the Warren Commission. And they're trying to figure out how to make them stop investigating. Then they talk about merchandise coming from Nevada, too risky in the past months. We'll have to close shop temporarily. My client couldn't hear everything too clearly about the next matter, but it was the subject of Town of Mercury. Now, reference was made in this letter to a sales meeting, the first since November, to be held in a place that sounded like Townhouse in Kansas City. And this place is called the Townhouse. It was a very popular hotel. And what happens is he says this is a mention was made of the names Kellogg and Broadway, which turned out to be the main streets in downtown Wichita, where the Townhouse Motor Hotel was located. It would appear that the proposed meeting was slated for March 18th, 1964, and a banquet room had been reserved for the unidentified group in the name of a textile firm. So for me, this is X-Protect setting up their meeting, the next meeting that they're going to have, and they're using as a cover the name of a textile group to book the hotel to do it. Now, the man, the salesman, said reference was being made to the name of a person sounding like Hoffman or Hockman, in conjunction again with this man Isaacs. Isaacs was to be relieved and the car destroyed. The FBI report identified it as a 1958 Dodge. One of the men could clearly be overheard saying, Isaacs, such a man with a good record, he would get involved with a psycho like Oswald. This comment would suggest that Isaacs had become a liability to the group of his connection to Oswald and implies that the two men were primarily concerned with guilt by association. And so Giesbrecht is the salesman here that they're referring to. And then, as I mentioned, they go on to, notice him, and then he runs away. Now, I think what's interesting is that this thing about Isaacs is also kind of important. And one of the things I want to put across is that in the Torbett document, they talk about a former Newsweek's editor who has the same name, who was related to this Defense Industrial Security Command. In the Torbett document, they mentioned the members of this group. And then the members of this group are very interesting indeed, because Defense Industrial Security Command is headed up by Wernher Von Braun, who is the German rocket scientist, the father of our NASA rocket program, and a former Nazi. Now, Von Braun is, his whole apparatus, the people underneath him, are listed as Clay Shaw, who Garrison charges in the assassination of JFK. You see how close in Garrison's getting and why he was so destroyed. But Jack Ruby, Louis Bloomfield, the Bloomfield Papers, who runs Permindex, Oswald, and this whole group, they're all identified as part of Defense Security Command. So this group, DISC, DISC, is the group out of which X-Protect operates. And this is the kind of the crucial piece that comes out, that's hanging out there in history in the Torbett document, and people couldn't go any further with it because it was such a download of information. But what it basically described in 1970 is the aerospace wing hooking up with a shadowy intelligence wing and forming a kind of assassination center. That's about as close as you get to a physical outline of what X-Protect is in the public. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're going to pipe some more things in, but I'm going to start taking your questions.
Do you have that audio of Kennedy that you're going to play?
No.
You're not gonna
We're
do
going to
it?
do that
Okay.
next one. Yes.
Okay. All right. So this is really interesting. I have a bunch of connected questions.
Yes.
So Zach Robinson says, so then they're using Mercury for X-Tech? No one you know says, isn't the element Mercury needed to power Vimanas?
Yes.
Sarah Belagignac
Makes
says,
it a good
Red
name.
Mercury, anti-gravitic, the Bell.
True.
Marduk the 12th says, Red Mercury has no reflection in a mirror. It seems to have many of the same attributes as monatomic gold. This is huge.
That is
this is
fascinating.
really connecting.
Yeah, absolutely. Great information out of the ideas room on that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X Series 89. This is deep into X-Protect, and we've gone deep in this information. We're looking at the UFO file and DISC and the Mercury Area 51 connection. And then we're looking at the combination of the setup of that UFO file through Vannevar Bush and his protege, John G. Trump. And then John G. Trump's move to investigate all of the Tesla papers, which, by the way, disappear. And then Wernher Von Braun's heading up of the DISC. And what Wernher Von Braun, by the way, had to say about alien visitors is actually quite fascinating also, and I'm going to put that on the record. But since I want to balance it out with questions here, as we only have so much time, we're going to start with your questions right now.
Dash Rendar, did Permindex use textiles as a front?
Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. They had a number of business fronts, and perhaps that is the name that they're referring to. Certainly, Permindex was run, remember, out of Montreal, but with the subsidiaries were all over the world, and Italy was where they were doing the real strong-arm political stuff to such a point that they got thrown out. And it was Garrison's investigation that ran into this bank that was financing these assassination operations, and that kind of ruined what Permindex was up to. And so they changed. After 1970, they changed, they disbarred, and they went into different aspects. Now, many people have thought that they've resurfaced as things like the BIS, as a kind of like financial clearinghouse for these types of activities. But Permindex is centrally laid out in the Torbett document also. And remember, the Torbett document is kind of like that inside WikiLeaks drop of its day, but nobody's ever been able to really interpret it because there's just so many figures and things happening in it, and not a lot of people understood that the aerospace wing was so powerful. This is another kind of oversight. Yes.
Najat Madri, was Mae Brussel aware of the UFO file? She did a great episode on Bill Casing.
Yeah, now, Mae Brussel was not a big promoter of the UFO part, but what she did is she felt that the Nazi Antarctica aspect was absolutely true, and she went deep on that aspect, saying that the saucer part was all pure Nazi. As far as I know, she never talked much about the alien aspect of UFOs. She related it to Nazi technology and Nazis surviving after the war and setting up bases and all the rest of it. If you look at the work of Dr. Joseph Farrell, he accepts both, that the Nazis did some of this and that and with their advanced technology, that a lot of what people were reporting, and even Kenneth Arnold's sighting, sounds a lot like what the Horton brothers were doing with the flying wing in that period. That is possible. However, we have to be honest. There's no way that the UFO sightings, the years of alien interaction, off-world civilizations, all the rest of it, can just be attributed to an advanced technology group here. I believe that we could, and there are people like Mac Tonnies who said we're operating side by side with an advanced civilization that has more advanced spacecraft than we do. I think it's quite possible, actually. But I think there's no doubt that we're being visited. I think it's undeniable. So we have to kind of keep that in mind as we do it. I don't think there's any single explanation around the UFO file that's going to be satisfactory. What's interesting is whatever is operating there, the X-Tech part of it seems to partake both of our advanced technology, kind of Tesla breakthrough technology, and also what we see operating with the UFO file. Yes.
Frank Monday, DJ, is X-Tech nuts and bolts or a metaphor for inner alchemy?
Well, when you think about torsion physics, for example, it has an aspect like that changes the nature of reality. So in that sense, it's not so nuts and bolts, and yet it has that physical aspect. So it's not like this is how you power a nuts and bolts ship so much as it takes on a little bit of both. That is, it's part physical and part of it belongs to this other kind of etheric energy realm. So, but certainly when people have approached the UFO aspect, it gets to a point where you realize it requires a certain level of consciousness in order to work with this technology, and that it is, in fact, a kind of consciousness technology. So, we get into this idea that when you look at things like, for example, the work of Edgar Cayce, he talked about how people's thinking could prevent bad weather or earthquakes or war, and that it was in their thinking. So, you find yourself mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and then when you go into mystery schools, they talk about the astral body, the etheric body. So there are obviously elements that are beyond just physical elements. And the sooner we understand that, especially when it comes to space travel, if we just think of it as a nuts and bolts, we're going to get so-and-so to a ship and all the rest of it, according to the mystery schools, we're missing out on what is going on there. Because in that mystery school point of view, like Steiner or Cayce, for example, the planets are phases of consciousness that we go through. So it does, I think your question is right on the money. Yes.
Esoteric 369 Wall. So is the two-eye stone a torsion field also?
Yes, absolutely. In my opinion, probably the two-eye stone, reflecting on what Cayce said had brought the Atlanteans down, but had previously powered their civilization. And then the two-eye stone aspects of it come here to America. But the vast majority, and to Mexico and the Yucatan, but the vast majority of it goes down in a section that we call the hot zone, which is in that area really between Bimini, Cuba, and Yucatan. That is the basic thing. And it borders on things, like the Caribbean is an aspect of it, and Belize on the other side, and that area is called the hot zone literally because when people go there who are working to map ocean floors or work for the military, they have to sign non-disclosure agreements for what they see down there. So if they see advanced pyramids or cultures, or like the work of Paulina Zalitsky, where she says the whole Cuban, pyramids and what she said looked like a city, well, that can't be disclosed. And they've had this ongoing geopolitical battle over those ruins for a number of years. That's what the hot zone is all about. And in Casey's work, what's in the heart of that is that the Two-Eye Stone basically was misused there and continues to cause kind of magnetic anomalies and things like that. So, when we look at some of the work that we've done around Ernest Hemingway and his relationship on one hand with JFK and on the other hand with the Casey family, and you start to bring those things together, it's quite remarkable. Yes.
Okay, I'll go straight to Trump.
Yes.
So Matt M., what do you think about Trump tweeting a video of himself superimposed onto the president from Independence Day?
Yeah, somebody had made that, and he went for it pretty dramatically. Yeah, Trump certainly knows a lot about the UFO file coming directly through John Trump. Let's think about this for a minute. This is a recent article in the Washington Post. It says Trump says he shares his famed uncle's science genius. A friend says the uncle would have been horrified. It's Washington Post, of course. But Trump talks a lot about his uncle. And what we need to understand, and what we've outlined in the series of shows, but it really shows up here, and it's going to be a big part of bringing these two episodes together, is that Trump comes in with the knowledge of the UFO file because his uncle is at the heart of being Vannevar Bush's protege. And when Vannevar Bush sets him off to do this task, he's the one that gets recommended for the job to go through Tesla's paper. That's a very secret operation. And he needs a man he can trust. John Trump goes through that process and he talks about it. And he said, the FBI agents had talked about, they wanted him specifically to know about taking down flying objects at a distance. Now it's interesting because that means if I'm sitting in California, I press a button and something goes down over the UK. But it's interesting that they use the term flying objects because this is 1943, before the UFO wave. So unidentified flying objects becomes the buzz term that the FBI will develop for this. But before that, what they were concerned about and what they wanted John Trump to find is that we're looking for information relating to pulling down flying objects at a distance. So if you just put unidentified in front of that, they're looking for UFO file references inside of Tesla's work. That's the way I read it. Now, what's interesting is that Trump, there's a few things about Trump. One is that when we brought forward the information about Vannevar Bush being his protege, it was not publicly available. Now, I had spoken with the History Channel, and they were in some kind of TV development a little earlier, and I had talked to them extensively about a project which didn't come to fruition because basically they, what they tend to do with TV a lot is they'll come in, they'll take a lot of your ideas and then they'll disappear, especially if they think
they rip them off.
Especially if you want anything to do with developing it, as I identified it that way. Ancient Aliens was the biggest. And I'll be very honest about it. I like speaking publicly about this. I gave them all this information about the Watergate lawyer, Douglas Caddy, and we set up an entire episode around bringing that information out. And then they disappeared with all the information, and they show up at Caddy's door, they film him, and then I never hear from them again. So this is how they operate. So what they did in this case was they developed a show called Tesla Files, where they did the same thing. About 6 months after the Tesla-Trump episode drops where we put that information out publicly, if you watch that program, they sit there and they go, oh, look what we've just discovered. Vannevar Bush is the protege of John Trump and sends him on this mission to do Tesla's papers. And they staged this whole thing about how they found it. All they had to do was watch 4 months before what we put out. So that's how they leak things. Just like this thing about James Earl Ray in Pascagoula is going to get leaked. It's going to, and this is the way that they operate. So all I can say is that, if you can get the information unfiltered, it's nice if a TV show does a good job with it. But very often you can see just even how they've dealt with me, how they want to run away with the material and do it their own way. And then they don't have any respect for the source, which is why, in that case, the series failed because they did such a terrible job. And they want to, very often, they want to take the ideas and just use the kind of like UFO abduction or black budget, whatever it happens to be. And there's another show now where this guy who's a CIA guy walks around exploring the black budget, right? And the script is like directly out of Catherine Austin Fitts. Mm-hmm. So it's like, you just don't have the courage to call Fitts up and say, do you want to do this? So this is the way I think that we see a lot of the TV stuff operate. Yes.
Okay. Giovanni Delgado. Was the New Yorker a secret Tesla tower like History Channel says?
I think given the experiments, like this was the kind of guy who situated himself in particular places. The important thing in Tesla's work, I think, is what needs to be explored further. There's so many aspects, but the Wardenclyffe aspect and the wireless transmission of energy and how that was really removed by the bankers and by JP Morgan, and they were scared out of their wits. And when you look at this, you'll also see, well, what happens is they get this information about what they can do. We could have had in 1912 a world with wireless technology, cell phones, could have had it all. Instead, they put us through this very slow paces while they develop oil profits and make us take on things that are unhealthy for the environment and all the rest of it. A lot of people say, well, anything about the environment is just some, New World Order plot. And it's not true. The environment is decimated by all the things that we do, but it's the corporations that are responsible for it. They're the ones who should pay for it. It isn't up to us to have carbon taxes. They're the ones who made the money on it. They should pay for it. Let's do a 10% tax on all the corporations and make them clean up the environment. We don't have to deny that there's pollution and there's environmental problems. There are. So, I think that's what, in alternative media, we need to get that going straight, which is there is an environmental problem, but they're responsible for it. And it's obvious because they've flouted all the rules all along. And they've made the great profits, and I was reading a thing about Apple sitting offshore with $35 billion, not reinvesting it, just letting it pile up and, not reinvesting it in jobs here, doing things here. That's a disgrace, and a lot of these corporations are disgraceful, greedy, controlling companies. And I think this is the thing that we're breaking through. And, when I said that this was a great week for humanity, it was because a lot of those things were collapsing. Big names were getting off of YouTube and saying, you're not going to censor me. And churches were being opened. And, and the Democrats were stepping in it. All these things, I think, say that, sometimes we're going to have a week where we win and sometimes they're going to have a week where they win, but we have to make sure that we take the game to them. Yes.
Okay, so give me one
Everyone,
second.
You're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Here we are, X Series 89, and we're going deep now on the UFO File and X Protect, Defense Industrial Security Command, Mercury, Nevada, James Earl Ray, and the Pascagoula case. These things are all related, and we put that on the record tonight. And we're going to do that in a part 2 of this episode as well, including a major piece around Trump and Tesla, which we're hinting at tonight, but it looks like we're going to get to it in part 2. Yes.
Okay, Ed Kaufman, does the hospital death of Forrestal have any key similarities to the death of Frank Olson?
Well, they both go out a window, yes. The development around LSD, I think, is particularly interesting because I think that they thought of LSD as a mind control tool, but I think that they found that people were very suggestible under it as well. And so, when we bring up the aspects of James Earl Ray being, when he gets to Los Angeles, one of the tracks that we can backtrack is that he goes and he sees a hypnotist and he wants to learn everything about hypnotism. So he's been hypnotized. This is the thing. In my opinion, this is why he's seeking out this master hypnotist. Sirhan is in a hypnotic state when he shows up and he's shooting bullets in the pantry at Kennedy, but he never actually, in reality, strikes Kennedy, even though he's grabbed for the crime. It is the security guard. Now, what's interesting is even according to the work of RFK Jr., he now believes and has put on the record very bravely that Eugene Thane Caesar, who was a person who just got the job at the hotel, Ambassador Hotel, 3 days before the assassination. That's some timing. That's like Oswald showing up in the window there on the presidential route. He's placed there. And what we look at with Thane Eugene Caesar is he had a gun and he was a security guard there, but where did he work? He worked for the CIA and he worked for Lockheed Martin. So the military contractor intelligence aspect crisscrosses there in another assassination. This is the way that it works. Now, that's 50 years ago. How deep in this process have they become? Now they have Bluffdale in Utah that gathers up every phone call and every email we ever make and says, don't worry, we won't read them. We just want to keep them for later. These intelligence units are out of control. And I do feel that the fact that Trump nominated a new DNI, Director of National Intelligence, is an attempt to pull the power back from agencies that are just completely out of control. And we have the ability to do it. On our side, on the independent media side, what we can do is we can say, no, we don't want any of the CIA info on the UFO file. We don't want them messing with what we're trying to develop for the public and getting at the real story. They're the ones who are behind the cover-up. So when you have researchers who very casually turn around and say, let's work with these CIA guys in TTSA, it's a real deal breaker. And I can't work with people who do like that because I won't work with the CIA. And I've invited Elizondo, who's a CIA agent and still a government contractor.
They're all ex-CIA.
Oh,
that doesn't count anymore.
And I've invited DeLong. They can come on the show and have a gentleman's debate about it anytime. I'm, open to it. But I understand that the TTSA is a CIA operation. So you have to start with that. And then you have all these people saying, oh, it's not a CIA government operation. That's ridiculous. That's absurd. Any UFO researcher who tells you that is just hanging in there for a paycheck. And that's dumb, because why be in UFOs for a paycheck? Go to Wall Street, become a day trader if you want money. The UFO field is not a place for money. It's a place to move the culture. So don't deal with the CIA. That's my message. Okay.
Dash Rendar says, don't let DJ forget he was going to mention Wernher Von Braun's statement on, quote, visitors.
I do have that here, and I am going to find it. So thank you for reminding me. Okay. Here it is. And Von Braun is complex because I believe that at the end of his life, he did feel remorse about what he had gotten involved with. And that's why I believe he left Carol Rosen with this message. And the message was about the various things that they would try. And the main thing being the alien invasion false flag at the end. And he got all the other steps right, except that we're also looking at this asteroid threat thing. And he said, this is what they are going to try at the end. And he had kind of a close relationship with her. I think he wanted to deposit that information inside of her and let her deal with it. And I think that she's done a lot to keep, for example, weapons out of space And her testimony is so crystal clear about this that she's one of the best. But anyway, here's von Braun, who, remember, was the understudy of Walter Dornberger and saved him from the gallows at Nuremberg by saying, I can't do the NASA research work unless you get him out of that. I can't do your space program if I don't have Dornberger. Dornberger creates the X plans. That's all you really need to know about X technology in terms of the public face of it. SpaceX, all of these things that are going on, Bigelow Aerospace and all the rest of it. If you understand that the program comes out of the advanced X technology program that they had in Nazi Germany, and that von Braun and Dornberger were in charge of that, then you're already ahead of the game. But here's what von Braun said. Okay, this is from News Europa, German publication, January 1st, 1959. Dr. von Braun is quoted as saying, we find ourselves faced by powers which are far stronger than we had hitherto assumed, and whose base of operations is at present unknown to us. More I cannot say at present. We are now engaged in entering into closer contact with these powers. And that comes out of a book called Camouflage Through Limited Disclosure by Randy Kopang. But the quote I've seen in Brad Steiger's work. And this is, one of those off-the-record conversations, just like when Admiral Byrd comes back from his great trip down to Antarctica and he says, we're dealing with an enemy and these flying saucers, and there's tons of saucers down there, and these guys can fly to pole easily, so we have to figure out what to do about them. And he gives that interview to a Chilean reporter. There are these things on the record, and they do get hushed up, because when people sometimes are talking to reporters, they will say too much. And once in a while, we do get those. But I want you to keep that in mind when it comes to von Braun, that I do feel that through Cal Rosen and through some of the messages that he left, that we're getting a little bit of something from him. Yes.
Ed Kaufman, was von Braun the co-founder of IONS with Edgar Mitchell?
Well, it's interesting. I believe that he conferred with him, but see, Edgar Mitchell set up what he was doing, I believe, after that. So I would think that von Braun's work ended in the 70s. So that's a good question, though. I think we can verify that one. But certainly he made the rounds. And let's remember the people that he was seen with when he was at Roswell. There's an intelligence officer who puts von Braun at Roswell. And who is it that flies in but Charles Lindbergh? We did a whole show on it. There's a weird thing. I want to mention this about the UFO field and why things like X-Protect are so important, but everyone gets sucked into TTSA and all the BS and the CIA lays out. On the record, Lindbergh is cited by an intelligence officer as being at Roswell. On the record, the Watergate attorney, that's a major historical figure, Douglas Caddy, who was there representing the Watergate burglars when they first got caught, and whose best friend was E. Howard Hunt, the ultimate spy master for the CIA. These people have gone on record saying that the CIA agent, his best friend, E. Howard Hunt, told him the Kennedy assassination happened over the UFO file, over sharing the UFO file, because Kennedy was going to do that with the Russians. Aside from Linda Moulton Howe, there's no one in the ufology world who wants to talk to Douglas Caddy, except Ancient Aliens, after I put that show together. But this is the problem. They want to go run around with Lou, and Harry Reid. You're not going to get any truth from those people. So we have things on the record. If you're a UFO historian, the first person you do is you go talk to the Watergate lawyer who says that the top CIA man, who was his close friend, told him this is why we assassinated the president, because he wanted to share the UFO file, because that's our top national security secret. Well, it's kind of important for history, don't you think, if you study UFOs? People in that field, Alejandro Rojas, you're going to spend the rest of your life just hanging around for Lou to give you information, or are you going to take things that are there and work with them? So this is the problem with the UFO field. George Knapp and stuff like that. They're just gone over the cliff with Lou and Tom DeLonge and wanting to get flown in by private jet to Tom DeLonge, who's, there's money around this thing, and maybe you'll get in one of the series or something. That's a disaster waiting to happen. All you need is the information. If a show like this can get you that information, if watching the information through Joseph Farrell's channel, just work with the information, and more people will come forward. And you don't need a false CIA enterprise. That's an entertainment conglomerate? Consortium. That's my 2 cents on it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're gone deep now into X Series 89. And the Pascagoula case, it's very important. And I am going to try to get Calvin Parker to come on the show. He's done some very important interviews, and I want to get to talk to him about some of these aspects. Litton Industries is now a deep pursuit of the X series, and there's a lot that we're going to be putting out in this regard. There's a lot of very important information around Litton Industries and the Corona spy satellites that they developed for the CIA through a company called iTech. So we're going to be doing a lot of those, and it's going to be explosive, and we're going to be learning these things together. And wouldn't you know, we're not going to need a CIA narrative TV show to do it.
Okay.
Yes.
Sean Jacques, what is the status of X-Protect's ability to suppress exotic tech now with Space Force reclaiming BB/CSAP? Are the new FE inventors still at risk? It's free energy.
Oh, yes. Free energy inventors are always at risk. And I think that there are working models for things that could transform the world. And we do have situations like 3D printers and things like that, which could, somebody could rush a product to market, and then everyone would have to deal with it. Think about this hydroxychloroquine situation. Now, there's something which for pennies can solve, there are incredibly talented medical professionals who have used it. It's been on the market for 65 years, and it could totally transform any of the medical aspects of dealing with COVID virus or anything like that. And instead, it gets incredible pushback from the media. Why? Because they want the Bill Gates vaccine, because they're part of a system that is put in place and propped up there to bring this other thing in. This is what needs, in the average person's mind, this is what the dots that they need to connect, which is, that the regular media is not a public service group. They are a paid private interest. And so they're trying to bring forward things that they get paid for. And it goes worse than that, too, because when you're in the media, you have to be part of the Council on Foreign Relations to get anywhere. And the Council on Foreign Relations has, not everyone who's in the Council of Foreign Relations is evil or anything, but that system, you'll get thrown out of that system if you, for example, are in the media and you say hydroxychloroquine would solve all this stuff, and there wouldn't be any lockdowns or any of that nonsense had they used it, and they're getting great results. And if they did that, that person would be crucified in the media. And the only people who've been able to do it are people on the conservative side. And this is what I mean about, if you're right or left, it kind of doesn't matter. If that person in the conservative suit on their side, I don't care if it's Fox News, if they're giving you the truth, that's where you go, and if you are getting the information from a left-wing Bernie Sanders supporter and they're right, then that's where you go. So I think this is crucial, though, because it's interesting what you're talking about in terms of like free energy. But to get back to your original question, the Space Force is a gigantic pull from the Trump administration onto that hidden X-Protect technology that resides inside the UFO file. It's their attempt to get at it. And it's a bold attempt, and I like certain aspects of what they're doing. The only thing that I object to is that in order to speed the process, they made it part of the armed services, and then they decided that space was a war-fighting domain. That's a huge mistake. And, whoever is telling Trump to do that, it's not good, because space, as initiated by the Kennedy administration, they signed on to treaties and they set the mode and they said there won't be any weapons in space. It's going to be for peaceful exploration, because he already knew he was up to his neck, surrounded by nuclear this and nuclear that. He said the world has to stop and step back from these things. We don't want weapons in space. That was the great wisdom that came to us from Camelot. And we need to honor that now that after 50 years, they're letting us have, hey, we get a space program back again. It's not a secret space program anymore. Do you ever wonder what happened in the 50 years in between the last moon landing? It's a little strange, isn't it? So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the nature of the situation, but that's a good observation about the Space Force. Yes.
I don't know if you're going to have the answer to this one, but I think this is where your research is going to be heading. David Donaway, was Lytton sharing bioweapon contracts with Halliburton and DynCorp, which were involved in sex trafficking in Eastern Europe?
Well, it's interesting. There's going to have to be a broad portfolio of Lytton. I can tell you this, which is they were associated with CIA activities relating to Greece and overthrowing the leadership in Greece in the late 60s. So also Lytton Industries, in taking over things like the shipping, obviously there's a drug aspect involved there, especially if you're on the coast, Gulf of Mexico. So, and Lytton was all over. I mean, it stretched Massachusetts, Beverly Hills, Mississippi, Nevada, and it operated globally, but having centers in so many different places that there's a good deal of information now to suggest what they were up to, that they were so close with the intelligence groups that they were just an arm, really, of the CIA. But when we take that into things like the Pascagoula incident, then we get a real, it's like an Area 51 realization, because that's when we start to see, the technology and the groups around it and what they do, and this goes for things like the RAND Corporation as well. These are, not that there shouldn't be military secrets. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm literally talking about the hoarding of information for private groups that belongs in the public domain. And there's a huge difference between that and saying, well, we can't let this out because some foreign country will get the edge on it. I mean, we've had it, the UFO technology for over 70 years. I think that's given us enough time to safeguard what we've developed. By the way, those other countries like China, like Russia, they have their own UFO programs as well. So this idea that everyone's going to sit around and wait for the CIA to give them information about what UFOs are is absurd. UFOs, I mean, if you look at the CIA, all they've ever done is lie about UFOs and just about everything else. Fundamentally, they're an organization that's set up to lie publicly. So how anyone could ever get it in their mind that you're going to sit around with a bunch of CIA agents and get the truth about UFOs is beyond my comprehension. So we need a totally new dialogue on that. And it's interesting. Sometimes I don't think that the independent media, who, by the way, swung an entire election in 2016, realizes its power or value. And I think it easily gets distracted by operations that come in, and I think things like TTSA or, certain television channels, cable channels. Also, it's like you have the ability to develop this subject and the topic in a complete fashion without anything to do. You have a series of researchers who can tap. It's nice to have government information, but there are ways and means to get to it without the biggest liars that we've ever had, who run an extra constitutional agency called the CIA. So fundamentally, that's a flawed strategy.
What it is, actually, the reason why our world is in so much trouble is because people have used the ends justify the means all the time, instead of spiritual is the way. It's you do it. You just start with truth. You start with integrity, and you move forward. And it might take longer, but you do it the right way.
Yes.
Anyway, so Hillary Rees says the show Iron Fist also has the Rand Corporation that has an underground adrenochrome immortality business through the Chinese hand.
I've never seen that show, but that's interesting.
We are going to research that, definitely.
I already like it.
Okay, so J.R. Foster, 1999. Didn't King's family win a lawsuit against the feds proving Ray innocent?
Yes. This is very interesting. In 1999, there was a civil case brought in the Martin Luther King case against someone named Lloyd Jowers, who had, in fact, confessed that he was involved in a mafia intelligence aspect of the Martin Luther King assassination. And he had decided to get the story out, and he was somebody who owned the property close by. And there were a series of people who corroborated his story. And the King family decided to get it on the record by suing for a wrongful death. And the judge in the case, after weighing all the evidence, decided that Lloyd Jowers was telling the truth and that the government was involved in the assassination of Martin Luther King. And the media stayed away from it. They just ran away from it. But what's interesting is Martin Luther King's family went to meet Ray in prison and to let him know that they didn't believe the story and that they knew that the government had killed Martin Luther King. That's quite a piece of history that was ignored there. And there was so much evidence brought forward in the case to prove Ray's innocence that now Ray, remember, as a patsy, he was a criminal, so that they knew. So we're not saying that Ray was some saintly figure, but we're saying that he was not the mastermind behind the MLK assassination, and that the official story isn't true. And also that he was not enough of a mastermind to move himself all across continents. This guy's going to Canada, to England, setting up to go to Rhodesia in Africa.
He's no criminal mastermind.
No,
he's a low-level armed thief.
He's the kind of guy who would hold up a grocery store, literally. And but he was perfect for this. And there's no question that, in my mind, from looking at the evidence, that since he was at Pascagoula and that Lytton owned the Ingalls shipbuilding firm where he worked at, and also where eventually Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson would work at, that connection is powerful. Now, some people have suggested that the alien abduction of Parker and Hickson was basically just something that was the military stage, because they're there, and after all, this is it. But I don't think that needs to be true at all. I think that we can be looking at something very, very interesting here about the fact that we have an ex-protector group operating in the middle of Mississippi there, and who are moving people like assassins around, or patsies who are fronts for assassins. And then we have an actual UFO abduction in a very high-tech fashion that takes place. And then it really has to make you wonder, what's going on here, because when you put those dots together, we're in totally unknown waters, because If it's not a military abduction, then what is it? Listen to this. Charles Hickson later claimed to get re-abducted. And his wife, after his death, said, what did happen is we were driving down the street, there was a huge light, and it came down and landed on the road, this craft. So his wife was corroborating his story. And then he said that they would telepathically communicate with him on a regular basis. You could say that the entire thing, if you wanted to, was a defense operation, a test, or that it was done in collaboration with aliens, or if it was just a perfect setup for an alien abduction, and that this was right in the interface of where X-Protect was, and it was basically something that they observed and tracked. I do find it interesting that Hickson had an ongoing experience. What I've found from surveying UFO literature is it's very often the one main story that people pay attention to, and then the rest they forget. The Betty and Barney Hill case, the classic one, people often say, well, they had this major thing that happened. Well, in fact, it went way back in her family. She had grandparents and things who had seen these craft. So this was an ongoing process. Betty and Hill would say that there were entire groups in New Hampshire that would hang out by the river to watch these things come in, and that she was seeing UFOs all the time, and she took photos of them all the time. So it's an ongoing kind of relationship that we see happening there. And when you look at Hickson with his story, he says the same thing. Okay, Miss Olivia, we'll take a couple more.
RS5, is the Mercury program and Mercury astronauts a wink and a nod to Mercury, Nevada?
I think it's very possible. Listen, Kennedy decides to visit Mercury because there's something very important taking place there. They try to discourage him. I'm sure it relates to X technology. They did not want him to be there. He insists they build an airfield for him to come in. Think about that.
So when does this happen?
1962.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when we think about it, when we think about Kennedy wanting to get control of the UFO aspect of the government, just like Trump is trying right now, we have to get into this understanding about it, which is Mercury now looks like a big piece of this puzzle, especially because it's caught almost randomly by fate by the strange salesman listening to David Ferry and talking to this other person about the assassination, and then he brings up Mercury, Nevada. Independently, people like Bill Kaysing, who's a big Apollo hoax person, when he believes that they shot this in Nevada, at Mercury, Nevada, we have to get into his information and say, why does he think that? What is it about Mercury, Nevada? And did that just become transported as to, Area 51? Is that when Area 51 becomes public in 1991 through Bob Lazar and all of this? Is this a move to get something out about that? Lazar, for all of the inconsistencies in his story, it does have proof that he was in Area 51. And he tells the story of being shot at. That's probably an X-Protect moment where they're trying to eliminate him before he can get out and be a whistleblower. I can't speak to Lazar's character and that he talked about graduating from MIT, but there's no record of him and all the rest of it. Sounds to me like that's just a lie. But I don't know. I think when you take Lazar, it's obvious he was around those programs because he knew a great deal about it, and he brought these things out at the time. And so the attempt to shoot at him while he was driving, for me, it sounds like an X-Protect kind of maneuver. So if that story didn't get out, you have to wonder about what we would understand in relation to the UFO file. I do think that story boosted. A lot of people would say, well, it's just disinformation and they cooked it up that way. I I don't know. It doesn't strike me that they get such a big benefit from having the Lazar story out there. I always thought the Lazar story came out in a weird way, and I don't think that he was the most forthcoming about it. You know, I don't. Obviously, there were things that he lied about, but I think it moved the culture in terms of understanding the story, and so eliminating him falls under that X-Protect wing. Okay, we'll take one more question, and then we'll set up part 2.
I don't know anything about this. Ed Kaufman, who's real pro, obviously,
Yes.
when is discussing Gordon Neville in
Oh, yeah.
Las Vegas doing his UFO work. And
Yes.
was he connected to the remnants of Hughes Aerospace? I don't know anything about that.
He was, yes, is the answer. But also, Gordon Neville shows up in 3 interesting places. He shows up in the Torbit document, which we discussed earlier. He shows up as a Oswald impersonator that early in his career. He had a facial resemblance to Oswald, actually. And he shows up offering Jim Garrison services about how to detect bugs. He winds up bugging him and giving away the tapes, and Garrison fires him eventually for bugging him. And then he shows up as a free energy UFO guy talking to Kerry Cassidy on Project Camelot. It's a pretty weird career.
Wow.
I mean, Novell is, he moved in that aspect, in that world, in that CIA corridor that was dealing with the UFO file. He probably knew what X-Protect was. I don't know. I don't think he was part of it, but he probably knew what it was. And with that is absolutely fascinating.
I have just one last question, because we never really got around to it. Greg McCoss. So who ordered the assassination of MLK, and who did he, the real assassin, work for?
It's a good question. Well, Martin Luther King had done a number of things, but there were 2 really big problems as we got into 1968. One, that Robert Kennedy decided to run for president. 2, that MLK had stepped forward and opposed the Vietnam War, which he had maintained a kind of neutrality, but then felt compelled to speak out about it. And there was a photographer who, William Pepper, who became the lawyer for James Earl Ray. He came forward and he showed King pictures of what was happening in the firebombing of villages in Vietnam. And King was like, I can't stand idly by and just not mention this. So he turns into an anti-Vietnam person, brings a kind of a spiritual message to that. And then he is also going to support Bobby Kennedy's run for president. So I think when LBJ gets out of the race in 1968, he realizes, I can't be at the helm running against Kennedy when they kill him, because it'll look weird. I got the job by one Kennedy being assassinated, and then here I am. That'll be the end of me. So he doesn't run for re-election, which that doesn't happen. Presidents run for re-election. That's the way it goes. And when a president doesn't run for re-election, it's a very strange thing to do. So LBJ, who was an insider from the beginning, by the way, in the 50s, they called him Senator NASA. And he was somebody who was deep in the heart of the space program. But he's a deep stater, and he elects to participate in the JFK switch out, where the CIA will assassinate JFK and LBJ will be put in, because otherwise he's going to go to prison, by the way. So when we look at that, and then we look at the MLK assassination, MLK is assassinated April 4th, 1968. RFK is killed on June 5th. It's only 2 months difference. So they had to eliminate King and RFK, which risked really a revolution in this country. And what you got during the 68 convention was pretty close to anarchy. So we have to take the King assassination in that context. He was doing the Poor People's March. He was mobilizing people. RFK was mobilizing people. They were going to get out of Vietnam. They were going to return the power to the people. Instead, those people got jettisoned. We got Richard Nixon. Nixon perpetuated the war, but then even he started to see that these guys were usurping presidential power, he tried to strike back at them inside their own corrupt system by firing people like Richard Helms and whatever, and they removed him from the presidency in a different way. So, this is the nature of those assassinations, but MLK's assassination was initiated by the same factors in the deep state that had eliminated JFK and RFK. There's no question about it. The tools that they used, the people that they used, according to William Pepper's deep investigation, were the military intelligence snipers. And the people where he was shot, they didn't see the shot come from the motel. They saw it come from that set of trees down below, and the angle of the bullet was coming up that way. So in any case, they got the assassination accomplished. If you've ever looked at the picture of where James Earl Ray was supposed to have shot MLK, it's absurd. He has to step into a tub and lean over and try to get a good shot, and he's not known as any kind of a good shot. And he wasn't there. And then supposedly he takes all this stuff when he leaves and he puts it in a bag, including cigarette butts and beer cans and all sorts of bizarre things. And he takes that pack with him. And he doesn't need, if he's the assassin, he can even leave the gun there. There's no reason to carry anything. And then he takes that and then supposedly panics and dumps that in front of the rooming house, and they find it, and it incriminates him because it has something of his in it. That's how absurd the story was. In part 2 of this episode, I'm going to get into the unusual qualities of this Eric Starvo Galt name as well, because I think it is very revealing about what we're up against in looking at this story. But with that, Ms. Livia?
I have one thing I've got to add. Okay, so Aether says, during my time in Pascagoula, I met so many people who expressed having UFO experiences.
Wow.
Just found it interesting.
Isn't that fascinating?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't that tell us a lot? What do you make of that?
I love it.
Well, to leave you on something special with that, Aether, it's a very interesting story, and I'm glad you brought that up. Here's a little something to keep in mind. In 1940, Vernon Presley, a Mississippian fresh out of Jailhouse Rock prison, moved to Pascagoula with wife Gladys for a 6 to 8 month stay. They lived with Vern's cousin, Sales Presley, in a one-room shack with screen walls. Both men worked in the shipyard. Then they moved to Tupelo, where son Elvis Presley could start in the first grade. In the 1950s, Elvis would work at a club in nearby Biloxi. Just one of those interesting footnotes to Pascagoula. And Jimmy Buffett has a song about Pascagoula because he was born there. But there's a lot of mysteries, a lot of mysteries deep in the heart of Pascagoula, Mississippi. And it looks like a nice place. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, get on board with the newsletter, sign up for it, make sure that you know what's coming up. We have a blockbuster of an interview coming up, and you're going to want to be on that newsletter in order to hear about it first. You don't want to miss this one. You do not want to miss this one. And it's coming up very soon. So make sure that you're on darkjournalist.com. Go there, sign up for the newsletter. It's easy. It's free. While you're there, subscribe to the newsletter. Get behind the work that we're doing on this program. And there's so many great supporters here tonight. You want to read off those?
I do. Okay, so we have a bunch. Thank you. Gil and Joy R. Joseph Fabry. Nacrius 3.7. Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce. Maggie Smith. Deborah J. Bush. Eurythmy is Fun, Jody Z, Irie A, Joseph Walker, a cult fan, 70s Libra Girl, Krog Dog 101, Ben Dover, Wayne Peak, Norma White, Kristen Irwin JD, Angel P, Jebediah Dean, Matt M, John Osborne, and Trioxin.
Oh, wow.
And we
incredible.
had a shout out for Sarah
Yes.
and
Sarah and her friend Fenris in Florida.
Fenris.
Have a great Memorial Day weekend. And for everyone else, have a great Memorial Day weekend. I'll do a few shout outs here. Najat, it's great to have you out there. Johnny Boy, Daniel Natal, haven't seen you in a while. Frank Castle, Dennis O'Neill, Pono, Ono Pono, Rene DeBlanc. Oh, fantastic. Okay, great. Occult fan, it's great to see you out there, sir. Xavier Hawk, Frank Monday, Flood, excellent. As usual, Modwiz, the man, the myth. Looking forward to more videos, sir. Scruples, always good to see you. David Donaway, Carolyn Goya, terrific to see you out there. Thanks so much. And we had Carly earlier. I saw Kate. Thank you so much for joining. Carl Young, Eliphas Levi, very interesting name there. Lady Zaga, Zach Robinson, Michael Gopi. Great crowd tonight. Unbelievable. We will be back next Friday. And between now and next Friday, something very interesting is happening, which is...
Keep your fingers crossed.
It's going to be a very special engagement. And so make sure you're signed up for the newsletter for that. We will see you all next Friday for part 2 of X Series 89. And we will dive deep into those connections that we've set up here tonight with Litton Industries and Tesla and Trump. Not to be missed. Thanks so much for joining us. And the final word, Miss Olivia, goes to you.
Oh, I'm starving. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. We will see you all next Friday.
Okay. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. And you know, it says end broadcast. As you and I both know, it never really ends.
Not around here.
Thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you next week. Get on that newsletter list. Don't miss it.